Okay, all right, good. So we're going to start. Okay, good morning, everybody. Good. So let me get on with it. Professor Falconi will appear shortly. I should have put his name here, shouldn't I? Okay, so yesterday, here's back to obedience. Latin Americans like to inculcate obedience as a value in their children. Yesterday, I was sort of talking about it's almost a conventional wisdom, I suppose, about Latin American development and why Latin America has diverged, particularly from North America over the last 200 years. I think, what Engelman and Sokolov noticed was there was something very interesting about this comparison between North and South America, that there were not these large development differences 200 years ago, that actually at the time, they were not really predicted by people. Even Adam Smith, Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations says, avoid colonizing, in high latitudes. Like nobody saw Massachusetts as being an attractive place to develop a colony. Europeans came with very similar types of strategies and ideas, as we talk about in Why Nations Fail. In fact, when the English colonized Virginia in Jamestown, they actually had models of colonization which was based on the Spanish. And the difference was that model of colonization didn't work in North America because there were few indigenous people, because you couldn't grow sugarcane or tobacco or cotton, you couldn't use slave labor, and a very different type of society emerged out of that equilibrium. So it's an interesting natural experiment. And then yesterday I kind of talked through some of the famous ideas and some of the empirical work which was tried to kind of put meat on this narrative of divergence, why it's been so persistent. We talked about the initial conditions under the sort of organization of the colonies, but why that's been so persistent over time, why it's generated such kind of complementary political and economic consequences. And then I was arguing, but we need a more sociological understanding of this persistence of inequality and this persistence of this model of extractive institutions in Latin America. Why, when the world has changed so much, how can that still endure? And then I talked about some ideas from sociology, from the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and then I even talked about a little mathematical model of Acemoglu, talking about how one of the reasons why inequality may persist in society is not through overt coercion, but that it creates incentives for people to kind of adapt to the system. Okay, and one way of adapting, at least in the model that I talked about, was to be obedient. If you're obedient, then you're more employable in some sense in a hierarchical society. And indeed, Latin Americans in the World Values Survey, Latin Americans stand out as it's the part of the world where parents are most concerned that their children will be obedient. And I sort of broke down the data by country. You can see the United States, obedience, it's about 50% of people say obedience is a value that they would like their children to have. In Latin America, it's typically much higher than that. Here's Colombia. Colombia, it's up at 80%. So it's significantly higher. So that's, just to think more sociologically. And I wanted to sort of finish this stream of thought and then make a transition to thinking about a different Latin America. So, the agenda today is more to talk about, new ideas or lateral thinking about how Latin America could change. I wanted to end the sort of sociological discussion by talking about an extremely important paper by Seth Zimmerman about the return to education in Chile. So this is a kind of bread and butter thing for economists looking at, what's the impact of different levels of education. In his case, university education, specific types of university education programs. What's the impact of that on your life chances, your career, your social mobility, your income, etc.? So, but what Zimmerman did is he had a very clever research design. So he got data from the Universidad de Chile and the Católica, and he was able to focus on a few sort of business-oriented degrees, law, business, a kind of applied mathematics degree. He focused on those, because these seem to be the things that ought to have very large economic payoffs. And he got all the records from the university. So in particular, he got the records of people who applied but did not succeed in getting into the program. And he wanted to compare the people who just, if you look at people's grades, he wanted to compare the people who'd applied but had not quite got into the program to the people who'd applied and just got into the program. So there's a big distribution of grades, but you can think sort of as that there's a cutoff, and some people just fall below the cutoff, and some people fall just above the cutoff. And the idea, is in a standard regression discontinuity design, is that those people are very similar. They're very comparable. Just some were just got over the cutoff and some fell below the cutoff. So we can compare those two groups to estimate the causal effect of getting into one of these business-oriented degrees. The causal effect on what? Well, the descriptive statistics, about 2% of college students get into these programs. 2% of college students who are admitted to these programs account for 41% of leadership positions. Think of that as CEOs and board members of listed companies in the Chilean stock exchange, and 39% of people in the 0.1% of the top income. Okay, so the very, very top of the income distribution. So these people who are in these courses are massively overrepresented in top kind of leadership positions in the corporate world, and also in the upper tail of the income distribution. So if you look at the raw numbers and you ask, what's the consequences of getting into this program, okay, comparing people who did the raw numbers suggest that getting into these programs has an enormous impact on your chance of taking one of these leadership positions or getting into the upper tail of the income distribution. Okay, in fact, so they have the admission, for example, increases the probability of getting into the 0.1% of the income distribution, the very, very top of the income distribution, by a massive 50%. Okay, so if you get into this program, it looks like, I say it looks like because you're going to see there's a subtlety here, very important subtlety. It looks like it increases your chance of getting into the top tail of the income distribution by 50%. Why would that be? Well, the return to education, of course. You get into these prestigious degree programs, you get very high quality education. Economists know education increases your productivity. So of course it increases your income and it increases your chance of getting into the top of the income distribution. So what's the mystery? Well, let me show you the mystery with a figure, with a classic regression discontinuity figure. So here we're looking at whether or not a person gets into the top tail of the income distribution. Okay, and here is male students in red. Okay, and here the diamond is female students. So the first thing you notice here is that, okay, so this is the cutoff. So here you can see men are already much more likely to get into the top tail of the income distribution.
Thanks.
Yeah,
we're not looking any chart screen. Sorry. Also,
we're not looking at the slides. Sorry, Professor Robinson.
Okay, hold on a second. I forgot to share my screen, did I? What an idiot. Okay.
Professor Falconi is here also.
Okay, good. Can you see it now?
Yes. Yes. Right now is. Thank you.
Right. Okay, but this is the important thing to see. The rest was just words. So you heard that. It's good. All right. So let's look at the pictures. Yes, and make Professor Falconi the co-host. All right. So let me go back to this first graph here. And we're looking at, think of this is the 0 is the cutoff. So to the left, these are students that didn't get into any of these degrees. They didn't get into these degree programs. And on the vertical axis is, think of this as being the probability that you get into the top 1%, the top upper tail of the income distribution. And to the right is the people who got in. And you can see there's a discontinuous jump here. So it looks like so green boxes are everybody. It looks like if you just get it, compared to just failing, getting in creates a significant increase in the probability of getting into the top tail of the income distribution. All right. The first thing you notice is that, that's actually not true for women. It's true for men. Red is men. It's true for men, but it's not true for women. So that's sort of puzzling. Why isn't human capital and university education should be productive for women as well as men? So why isn't there a jump in the probability for women? And to get into that, let's break it down by what high school you went to. Okay, and red is non-private, and green is private. So what Zimmerman finds is that it looks like on average there's a big return to getting into one of these degree programs. Okay, there's a big increase in your probability of getting into the top of the income distribution. And if I look at panel B here, where instead you're looking at leadership positions, there's a significant increase in the probability that you'll attain one of these corporate leadership positions. But when I break out the sample between people who attended kind of elite private high schools and people didn't, you can see that the jump is completely driven by people who attended private high schools. So again, you can see that amongst the people who didn't succeed in getting into one of these programs, people in private high schools are more likely to get into the top 0.1% of the income distribution, and than people who went to public high schools and non-private. Sorry, this is always confusing because in England and the United States, public and private is the other way around. So private schools are these fee-paying elite kind of schools in Santiago de Chile, and you could say, well, okay, these people who go to these schools have wealthier parents, so they're wealthier parents. Obviously, they're more likely to become, rich themselves. Fine, and that's why this regression discontinuity design is so interesting, because here, you can estimate the causal effect, somehow controlling for the fact that these people's parents are richer, so they're going to have better opportunities. And this is what's really interesting. So you see that for people who didn't go to one of these elite private schools, actually getting into this university programs does nothing for the probability of getting into the top of the income distribution. But if you're already in one of these private schools, there's a significant increase in the probability of getting into the top of the income distribution by getting into the university programs. So getting into university programs pays, but only if you went to a private school. Okay, so, and you can see exactly the same thing. It's a bit noisier with leadership positions, but again, on the right-hand side, you see for people who didn't go to one of these private high schools, there's no increase in the probability of getting one of these leadership positions unless you went to but if you went to a private school, then there's a discontinuous jump upwards. Okay, what's going on with women here? Well, these private schools, until about 10 years ago or 15 years ago, every single one of the top private schools in Chile only admitted boys. So women are sort of rationed out of this because they're all boys' schools. Now there's one that allows girls, but I don't know, I don't think it shows up in his data. So this, of course, you could say this is about gender discrimination, and it is, it is about gender discrimination. But in the context of the paper, what seems to be driving this is the fact that girls were not admitted into these elite private high schools, so they didn't get a chance to get this kind of jump here. So what's Zimmerman's interpretation of this? Well, there's only a return to human capital if you know the right people. If you're part of the right social networks, you have the right connections, you're in this kind of elite system, then there's a big return to having a university education. But if you're not part of the elite, then that doesn't get you anywhere. Okay, there's no return to actually getting into one of these programs. Okay, So I think this is a fantastic paper in the spirit of this sort of sociological analysis. That, you know, if you thought about the Colombian example of this, Colombia is more complicated, you know, because Colombia, you know, you have the sort of Bogotano elites, but you have elites in Medellin, you have elites on the coast, you have elites in Cali. So Colombia is more diverse and heterogeneous than Chile. You know, in Chile, they're all in, you know, Santiago, and the system is more kind of hegemonic. And, you know, but in some sense, the fact that this is going on in Chile is sort of even more interesting because Chile is supposed to be the most functional Latin American society with the most kind of effective state, the least corrupt state, you know, doesn't have clientelistic politics, et cetera, But you see that at some deep level, Chile is just as kind of oligarchic as anywhere else in Latin America. And, you know, so that's why, you know, if I'd shown you this in Guatemala, you know, you might have been a lot less surprised than if I showed it to you in Chile. So his interpretation is he doesn't have data on these networks, or, you know, how you actually how is it that you actually get into the top of the income distribution, or how is it that you get into these leadership positions. But the interpretation is that, you know, you need to be part of the right social network. Otherwise, you know, having this very high quality human capital just doesn't pay off if you don't have the right connections. So this is a very sort of sociological result, I think, very much in the spirit of the kind of Engelman-Sokolov agenda, you know, but with more sociology, which is what I was arguing yesterday would be a good thing. So this is a beautiful paper, I think. Okay, so that's the sort of traditional narrative, you know, that since Engelman-Sokolov wrote, and there's been a lot of research on this, you know, it's become the kind of hegemonic narrative in Latin America. And so how do you get out of this? Where's the room for optimism? You know, well, remember in the first lecture I said this hegemonic narrative, to which I've contributed myself, I suppose, sort of portrays almost, you know, the failings of Latin America and relative to North America. And, you know, and so the implicit agenda, it's like the Washington Consensus, you know, it's sort of identify all the problems in Latin America, identify where the Latin Americans go wrong, and try to make yourself, you know, more like the Yankees. Okay, so a lot of that literature is about trying to identify institutional reforms that can sort of improve this equilibrium. You saw a very famous example earlier in the class, the work by Faraz and Fainan about the anti-corruption audits in Brazil. So you know, that's a sort of paradigmatic example of the way that, you know, we've thought about this equilibrium. So, you know, we try to reduce corruption, or we reform the electoral system to try to make it less clientelistic, or we introduce reforms in the state to kind of improve meritocracy, try to impose meritocratic appointment and promotion within the state. So we think of all the things that go wrong, and then we try to think of reforms that could improve the equilibrium. Okay, and if you're trying to think, you know, very optimistically, then maybe all of these things accumulate, and at some point, you know, there's what Thomas Schelling called a sort of tipping point, and the equilibrium radically changes. You know, there's Faraz and Fainan's paper, you know, that shows that this had the consequence of reducing corruption. Okay, so auditing, transparency gives voters more information, improves the equilibrium. There's a fantastic paper by another Brazilian scholar, Thomas Fujiwara at Princeton, looking at the introduction of electronic voting in Brazil. So before this reform in the 1990s, people had to kind of write in the name of a candidate or the number of a candidate on the ballot, and people made lots of mistakes. And so their ballot was just thrown away. Then they introduced this electronic voting system, and Thomas shows that, you know, this really empowered particularly people with lower levels of education or illiterate people. So they were able to kind of much more effectively vote without making mistakes. And this shifted the kind of electoral equilibrium towards greater provision of public goods, particularly education. So, you know, so there's an example of a kind of small institutional reform that improves. Faraz and Fainan, small institutional reform that improves. So maybe you get to a tipping point. We just do lots and lots and lots of little reforms, and then the world dramatically changes, like a sand pile collapsing or an iceberg or something like that. And maybe, maybe. But here's a picture from a more recent Faraz and Finan paper, which is not what the paper is about. But I saw Claudia Faraz presenting it at Chicago, and it's a great paper in many ways. But this is the figure that stuck in my mind. Okay, and what is this? This is just, so here's when they start these corruption audits that Faraz and Finan originally studied. Okay. And this is the number they do. This is the number of municipalities which are audited. Starts off at 300, goes up to 400, back to 300. Bleh. What's happening? You can see that the audits are basically just disappearing. So the economists come in. The economist shows this improves transparency. This allows voters to discipline corrupt politicians. What's the response of the politicians? Oh, let's get rid of the audits. So you see here, when Claudia Faraz put this picture up, I thought, like, oh gosh, this is sort of indicative of why we study political economy and why it's so difficult to actually do these piecemeal reforms of the sort that they talked about, because the politics doesn't fit with the politics. And so what's happening in Brazil essentially is that the politicians have just been trying to get rid of these audits. And so this doesn't look like a very enduring way of changing the equilibrium. Okay. So what is an enduring way of changing the equilibrium? Well, I don't know, but we're going to talk about some ideas today. And I'm going to start by talking about them in the context of the state and trying to think in a deeper way about how states in Latin America, and in particular about Colombia, because I know more about Colombia and I can talk about some research, how that state actually kind of works and how the state is constructed. Because I think once we understand that a bit better, then that's going to generate some ideas about where change could come from. So this is a theme that Jose and I kind of develop in this paper that I'm going to talk about in a bit. But let me introduce the theme, by going back to something I talked about in the second lecture, which is Robert Bates's work. I talked about Bates's great book, Markets and States in Tropical Africa, which is, maybe the most important kind of conceptual book about how to think about comparative political economy, how to think about how politics determines policy and what creates variation in politics. And in a later work, as I discussed, Bates applied this thinking to Colombia. And he asked the question, why is it that when you had all these coffee smallholders who should not have been able to solve the collective action problem, somehow coffee policy favored the coffee producers? Okay, and his argument was political competition. Okay, there was competition between the liberals and the conservatives, and in a democracy where there's real competition, it's actually advantageous to have a lot of people with a common interest in good coffee policy, because then the politicians have to attract them. And the way they attract them is by offering good coffee policy. Okay, but I'd like to start off by saying, it's a very nice argument, but I think it's almost certainly completely wrong, as a theory or an explanation for the origin of the National Federation of Coffee Growers. In fact, here's an exercise I did, which is, if you look at there's a very detailed coffee census from 1928. There's a wonderful book which was recently republished by the Banco de la República called Colombia Cafetera, which is sort of a census, of all the coffee being grown in Colombia. And what's fascinating about that is if you take that data and you correlate it with data from the 1918 census, in the 1980 census, it actually records at a municipal level how many state officials there were. And what you see is that it's very negatively correlated with coffee. Okay, so actually, where coffee was expanding, think about Caldas, Quindío, Risaralda, these places in the Antioqueño frontier, where coffee was expanding was into a kind of vacuum of authority, into places where there was no state. Okay, so these frontier areas, the state was absent. All right. So how did the National Federation, where did the National Federation of Coffee Growers come from? It was a substitute for the state in this frontier. Okay, so Colombia, you know, one of the most fascinating things about Colombia is the existence of these parafiscales, you know, where the government basically gives to a private entity the right to tax people. The National Federation of Coffee Growers basically has the right to tax coffee producers. Okay, so why would a state devolve the right to tax to a kind of non-state entity? Because that's how the state is organized in Colombia. And I'm going to try to get into that much more in the next half hour. Okay, I think this is a fantastic example of what was going on here. Was not political competition between the conservatives and liberals. What was going on was the construction of the state in these peripheral areas. And via the National Federation of Coffee Growers. That was a substitute for the state itself actually kind of occupying this territory, because the Colombian state is not really interested in occupying these peripheral areas. It finds substitutes for it. And sometimes it helps construct them, like in the National Federation of Coffee Growers case. And other times, there's much more spontaneous creation of institutions and groups and organizations in these spaces. So Jose and I talk a little bit about this in the paper on the webpage, because Marco Palacios, the great historian Marco Palacios, his first book, his dissertation about the coffee in Colombia, has a very interesting discussion of this expansion into these frontier areas and how the politics worked and how sort of authority emerged and mediated with the state. Okay, so that's what's going on here. To understand this and understand why coffee policy was favorable in Colombia, actually you have to understand not political competition, I don't think, but you have to understand state formation and the architecture of the Colombian state in these, you know, what at the time were these peripheral areas. Okay, so that's, I want to talk about this core and periphery and the equilibrium between the core and the periphery. That's just a kind of way of getting into this. You know, called Colombia, where I do talk about this core and periphery, and I discuss a lot of different mechanisms that sustains this core periphery relationship. You know, there's a core in Colombia with much more functional institutionality than this periphery. The periphery is where the violence is and the chaos and the paramilitaries, as I'm going to show you in a minute. And why, you know, how should I think about that? And I think what we're going to argue, you know, a lot today is that you shouldn't think about that as a sort of state in the making, you know, like the narrative that you have in Colombia and many parts of Latin America is this narrative of sort of, we're getting there slowly, you know, but we know where we're going. You know, there's this idea of a sort of state with capacity and bureaucracy and rules and enforcing and taxing, and, you know, and it's often called a Weberian state because Max Weber, the sociologist, was the great kind of theorist of the state. You know, he defined the state, for example, to be the entity that possesses a legitimate monopoly of violence in a given territory. Now you can see straight away that's not a definition that applies to Colombia in any way. You know, the Colombian state has never had a monopoly of violence, you know, legitimate or otherwise. And I think more importantly, I don't think it's ever aspired to have a monopoly of violence. Okay. But just to back up and talk, I don't want to talk about this paper too much, but that paper, you know, I talk about all these different kind of mechanisms that sustain this core periphery equilibrium. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about this core periphery equilibrium today. Okay, I don't think this is just restricted to Colombia. If I have enough time at the end, I'll talk about some research I'm doing in Rwanda and East Africa. But I want you to kind of get the image that it's an equilibrium, this core and periphery. It's not that there's some onward march of progress and state formation and Colombia is turning into this kind of Weberian, you know, Germanic kind of Prussian state. It isn't. But understanding this equilibrium and this relationship, we think, Jose and I think, is actually changes the way you think about many things, and in a potentially optimistic way, let me say. Okay, so if you read The Misery in Colombia, that's inspired by a very famous 19th century book by Samper called The Misery in Bogota. I emphasize a lot these different kind of Machiavellian political economy mechanisms. One example which I enjoyed a lot, is, we'll come back to your pal today, is, the piscinas de ola, so Mauricio Cárdenas, when he was Minister of Finance, complained bitterly about, corrupt politicians making, wave pools in Yopal, and here it is, at least, in Casanare, here it is in Yopal, and I guess it's okay to have a wave pool in Anapoima, but in Yopal, forget it, you're not allowed to do that. But Mauricio Cárdenas was using this as an excuse to sort of say, well, we can't give money to these people, they're all corrupt, so if you can blame the periphery for being corrupt, then you can keep all the resources in Bogota, because, if you give it to the periphery, it's all going to get stolen. It's going to make wave pools. And so we have to keep all the resources here. So you see all the time in Colombia that you blame the periphery, for being bad. And that gives you an excuse for kind of hoarding all the resources in Bogota. Of course, you also want to loot the periphery. So, I talked about, Sarmiento, Rio Paila, all of that, Antillanora. So the fact that in the periphery, property rights are insecure, the state doesn't implement policy, doesn't enforce rules, that allows people with power to loot, to exploit that insecurity of property rights. And that's exactly an example of that. So there, it's an argument for why you want to keep the periphery like that, because you can exploit those weaknesses if you're powerful enough, okay? And also in the paper, I talk about, this idea that, keeping the periphery disorganized is good because it doesn't threaten elite power. I was in Colombia where they had these paros, 8 or 9 years ago. And it was sort of fascinating when the paros started, because everyone is so obsessed with sort of parochial interests, like there's the dignidad papero, dignidad cebollera, or all these different movements, with very parochial interests. They want the higher price of potato. They want the Colombian government to buy some tons of panela or stop importing eggs from Ecuador. Very parochial interests, very fragmented. They can't kind of forge a common agenda. Okay, so that's very easy for the Colombian government to deal with. You just buy some panela and keep some eggs back in Ecuador and a few subsidies here, and it all disappears. That's very easy to manage politically. So there's this argument that the periphery, is very ineffectual politically because it's so fragmented and diverse and heterogeneous, and people can't, and that's why there's no roads, in the periphery too. You just keep people where they are, and they don't threaten to change the system. Okay, so there's many Machiavellian, I call them Machiavellian, political strategies that you could imagine to keep the periphery where it is, and we've seen other examples in the course. Leopoldo talked about this paper that he and I wrote on the need for enemies, about how, having a kind of lack of a monopoly of violence, which is concentrated in the periphery, actually can give you a political edge. So, but I want to focus on different things today. Okay, this is very, you could say this is sort of very much in the spirit of the traditional narrative of the political economy of underdevelopment in Latin America. And today I'm just sort of pointing that out, and I want to say, we're trying to move on from that position. Okay, even, okay. So yeah, I talked about that. Okay, so let me start talking about this with some research that's kind of ongoing with Juan Sebastián Galán, in the economics department in Los Andes, and my colleague here at the University of Chicago at the Harris School, Maria Angelica Bautista. And this is about the paramilitaries, but it's also trying to kind of think in a deeper way about how the Colombian state is organized. Okay, so the National Federation of Coffee Growers was my first pass at that, but now I'm going to get deeper into this because we actually have some data. And years ago, I was reading a newspaper and there was a quote from Ernesto Baez, one of the kind of jefes of the paramilitaries, the autodefensas, and he sort of says, tongue in cheek, he's a clever guy, to a magistrate. This is so after the demobilization of the paramilitaries in 2006, this peace and justice process started, and the evidence that I'm going to show you comes from this peace and justice process. But he remarks to a magistrate, kind of sarcastically, how could a small independent state work inside a lawful state such as ours? What's he talking about? Well, he's talking about the kind of really existing Colombian state. The title of this project, it doesn't, this is the working title, the really existing Colombian state. I don't think it's just Colombia actually, but this is the way the state works everywhere in Africa, in my experience. But he's sort of saying there's a lawful state. That's the Palacio Nariño or the Cámara or whatever. There's the sort of the constitutional state. But then there are these small independent states, and he's asking, how does that work? How do those relate to each other, and how do they function in a kind of equilibrium? And I think that's sort of key to actually understanding lots of things. And I'm here I'm sort of ranting about something I talked about before, which is that when I talked in the first lecture about state capacity. And I talked about the project by Pablo Cherubin and Melissa Dell and Nathan Lane in Vietnam, looking at using this natural experiment to estimate, the consequences of having rational, legal, Weberian authority as opposed to patrimonial authority. So that's a great example of how in social sciences, Weber, we think of this sort of dichotomy. There's a Weberian state and there's this patrimonial thing. And the process of development is sort of shedding patrimonialism and embracing rational legal state. That's the narrative I was just criticizing in the Colombian case. But that's a beautiful example of an empirical paper trying to sort of look at exactly that. Okay, and what we're saying here is that actually, that's probably not a very good model of how states really work. Actually, states are a kind of mixture probably of different elements, including patrimonial and rational legal. And this is a point right today. Even this whole notion of patrimonial authority, I find kind of deeply confusing in this context. So I'll hold that thought and I'll come back to it. Okay, I think it's wrong the way people think about this. Patrimonial states weak, rational legal states strong. Development is about getting rid of patrimonialism and institutional reform and becoming rational legal. I think there's something very misleading about that kind of analogy and that story, as we'll see. Okay, so what we're trying to do in this paramilitary study is sort of use this as a natural experiment in kind of how the Colombian state is actually organized. Okay, and how this periphery works and how it organizes. Okay, here's Ernesto Baez on the left. I'll come back to this picture. Here's Mancuso, and here's Ramon Izaza. I put Ramon Izaza here because I'm going to talk quite a bit about Ramon Izaza because I know a lot more about him than the other guys. Okay, so as I said, the Colombian state has never possessed a monopoly of violence in large parts of its territory. There's been the governed core and this periphery. Okay, so what happens in the periphery, and I think, later on today, especially when José talks, we'll try to get more into the social psychology or the culture of the Colombian state and to think in a deeper way about why there is this core kind of periphery distinction. It's not just about political economy, it's about culture as well and social psychology, as we'll see. Okay, so there's this governed core and there's this periphery, which is sort of self-governing. Okay, it's governed, it's connected to the core. It's connected through social networks and different linkages in different ways. It's a sort of much more fluid than the core. And there's a lot of scope for entrepreneurship in the periphery. You know, groups form like the paramilitaries, like the guerrilla, like, you know, many other sort of independent movements, and they connect or not to the main state. Okay, so the way to think of paramilitarism in Colombia is, we claim, you know, is the spontaneous creation of these different groups in the periphery. You know, so you know, if you look at the autodefensas that demobilized in 2006, you could say, you know, they go back into the 1960s, some of them, certainly into the 1970s. Ramon Izaza started in 1977. He started a group called Los Escopeteros, the shotgunners, 10 guys with shotguns in 1977, just kind of mobilizing in the Magdalena Medio to sort of protect themselves from the guerrilla. That's how it started. So they actually went to the state. He was a former soldier, Izaza, and he went to the military in La Dorada and asked, you know, could you give us some guns and things like that? And the military told him to take a hike, you know, like, go away, we don't want anything to do with you. So he didn't have much to do with the state. He just mobilized. Okay, so that's what happens in peripheral Colombia, and we're trying to study this mobilization. It may complement the core, it may compete with the core. So think of the FARC and the ELN and these other groups as sort of, they're competing with the core. They have alternative projects. They don't even have a project to overthrow the core. Okay, but that can happen, you know. But it could be more complementary, and that's, you know, that was the autodefensas. They were not wanting. Didn't want to overthrow the core. They wanted to complement the core. You know, and this is where Pablo Escobar comes, and, you know, the whole story of Pablo Escobar, negotiated with the state and whatever. Okay. All right. So you know, so that's how I'm going to think about that. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about the Magdalena Medio, and then I'm going to back up, and so I'm going to talk about Izaza's group, because I've studied that. We did some field work in the Magdalena Medio, so I know a lot about it. And then I'm going to back up and I'm going to talk about the details of this front, just to kind of show you how interesting it is. But then I'm going to back up and I'm going to ask, you know, how general is this, and what's some broader hypotheses about the way these institutions or these groups are functioning in the periphery. Okay, so let me show you here's where the autodefensas de Magdalena Medio operated, and, you know, here's how they were organized in the year 2000. So they started in 1977. Here's Izaza, as I said. He started this group, you know, in 1977. They got 10 shotguns. Why did they start in 1977? Because in 1975, the FARC opened a front in the east of Antioquia, in the Oriente, and they started taxing people and stealing people's cows. And Izaza was like a little farmer, and, you know, he'd been a soldier and he was a little farmer, and he just didn't like it. So he mobilized against this in 1977. And then the group grew. Of course, there was this huge expansion of paramilitarism, especially when the Castaño brothers got involved in it. And in the year 2000, this is how this front was, you know, think about this as a block. And the block consisted of, you know, 6 fronts. Izaza was head of the central front. And here's the other commanders. Pájaro, you know, they all have these nicknames. He was in charge of this Frente Celestino Mantilla. This guy, El Gorre, he was in charge of a Frente Oma Izaza, which was named after a son of Izaza. This is one of actually Izaza's son, sort of Oliverio Izaza, you know, known as Terror. This is yet another Izaza's sons, alias Roque. And this is Magiva. This is Luis Eduardo Zuluaga, alias Magiva, who was married. He was the son-in-law of Izaza. So it's actually pretty interesting. You see, it's quite patrimonial here. You know, this is quite patrimonial. One thing we actually can look at is, you know, so we have data. I'll show you a little bit of the data from the peace and justice process. We have data basically for all the fronts. So at the moment we have about 120 fronts. So there were more or less 35 large paramilitary blocks. And within each block, there were these different fronts. So here are the 6 fronts. Some of them, had far more fronts than this. So the Bloque Norte, which was the bloc that Jorge 40 was in charge of, had a lot more fronts than this. So we're thinking of the organization of these different blocks, and we're trying to understand the way these fronts operated. And you can see straight away, talking about patrimonialism, this is a pretty patrimonial organization here. Okay, so that's that's how this thing was organized. And what did these people do? Okay, well, how did they get going? I said they got going kind of spontaneously to fight against the FARC. Okay, and they developed different sorts of strategies and behavior to do that, and they integrated with the government in different sorts of ways. Okay, so I think the way I want you to think about this is there's the Colombian government, there are these huge kind of spaces, and in these spaces, groups emerge. There are problems, the guerrilla, there are problems. So public goods are missing. So there's an incentive to organize to provide public goods, in this case, security, maybe, or maybe insecurity also, and then you can get in, once you're organized, you can get involved in all sorts of other activities like coca production, for example, and drug dealing, because, who's gonna stop you doing that? Not the government. So there's a lot. I put these, I don't want to talk about all, I'm not going to read through these slides, and I just wrote up some of the history of this Magdalena Medio group, just to give you a sense. It's fairly complicated, but at the time of the demobilization, there were about 1,200 people in this group, like armed soldiers in this group. So it was a pretty big thing, and it was spread out over, over that area. Okay, and I'm just to give you an example of this, let me talk about Megiva. So Megiva was particularly kind of interesting. There's going to be a question of how representative this is, but I'm going to show you some data on that. So I couldn't tell you the answer to that a couple of years ago, but now I can. But what can I say about Megiva? Well, here's the organization of his front. The front was named after his brother, who was murdered by the ELN. So him and his brother got into paramilitarism, and then his brother was murdered. So the front was named after his brother. And here's the organogramma, you could say. And here's Megiva at the top, and here's its organization. So you can see it's organized into three wings. There's a political commander, there's a military commander, and there's a finance wing. So they were heavily involved in taxing. They taxed production of milk and potatoes. They taxed big landowners. In fact, in the court documents, there's a list essentially of every landowner and his and his block. Okay, and they had different commanders within his territory. Okay, so they even had, at some point, they had a group in Comuna 13 in Medellin. So here's the the political commander. What is political? So military commander, that seems straightforward. Finances, that's straightforward. That's the people who are in charge of raising the taxes and collecting the taxes and accounting for the taxes. And here, what was the political commander? What was their political mission? That's an interesting question. And the political mission was really combating, combating the guerrilla. That was their political mission. Okay, so they opened a front they opened a kind of organization in Comuna 13 because, to combat expansion of the guerrilla in the comunas in Medellin. So that's the way to think about, and they had these, within this area, that mostly the municipality of Sonson, but also San Francisco, where Megiva was born. I'll come back to that later on. Sonson Bajo, which is like down the mountain, Carmen Viboral, La Union, in these municipalities sort of clustered around Sonson, they had these commanders, in different areas, and then, finances and military commanders in these different areas. Okay, so they had these estatutos. So here's the estatutos, and, you can see here, this is the sort of, this is the kind of the agenda, okay? Una organización antisubversiva en armas y en el campo político, un movimiento de resistencia civil. Okay, so he's sort of, it's an anti-subversive organization, and it's fighting against la violencia guerrillera. So that's, they're organized against the guerrilla. The government doesn't do anything. You can see intereses desatendidos por el Estado. Okay, so there's a sort of, they'd like to talk about this a lot. They're abandoned by the state, and so there's a guerrilla. There was all these problems. So you organize against it. Okay, so one interesting question, you might think in your mind as like think about this idea of this architecture of the core and the periphery and all these groups. Is this the state, or is it not the state? Is it part of the state? It's kind of organizing. It's, it's connected to the state in many ways. Many of these groups were got heavily involved in politics. So, I did some work with Rafael Santos on that, about the involvement of these groups in politics. So, it's a question, I don't know the answer to it myself, but I'm just sort of throwing it out there. Okay, and then it's talking about the ideological platform, but fighting the guerrilla. Okay, so yeah, I just threw some things up here just to give you a sense of like how rich this is as a source of information. So these are just, so McGeever and all these people appeared, in front of these magistrates, and as part of the transitional justice process, they were asked, about organization, about their motivation, about what did they do, how did they raise money. It's like absolutely fantastically interesting. So, but putting a data set together is complicated because there's millions of pages, literally, of these court documents. So it's sort of it's challenging. They had a legal system. I jumped over this, but they had a radio station. They had a hymn, a prayer, and they even gave out, medals. They had the order of Francisco de Santander, so they had the grand, so they gave out medals. They had the whole thing, it's very well thought out. Okay, so they had tax collectors. I talked about that. What did they do? So remember, they were fighting against the FARC and the ELN. Okay, so how did they sort of do that? Well, they very much had a kind of hearts and mind type strategy, meaning they provided public goods. So this is a barrio called El Paraíso that McGeever built in La Danta. So La Danta, which was sort of in the municipality of Sonson, but down, not up in the mountains, but down Sonson Bajo. He built, houses for poor people. What else did he do? He built schools, of course, public goods. He built a health center. So here's the health center he built in La Danta. And, and of course, he built a bull ring as well, because it's about bread and circuses, that famous image of how the Roman state, kept people happy in Rome with bread, bread and circuses. So here's you saw the bread and here's the circuses. And he built lots of roads. So here's a reconstruction. This is something we reconstructed kind of in person doing field work. Here's La Danta. And, he built all this system of roads around his capital, where his base was, to facilitate the movement of troops and things like that. Okay, so this was a basic sort of strategy, providing hearts and minds. He talks extensively about his motivation for doing this, and it's like not complicated. It's just, you want to have people on your side. You want people to give you information, to tell you, where the guerrilla are. You have to convince them that, that you're making an effort to make their lives better. You can't terrorize people, into, of course he'd say that, of course there was terror and there were massacres as well. And I'll show you some data on that, here's McGeever talking to the judge about social work, which was one of the basis or ideological platforms for us to accumulate masses. So it's a sort of standard hearts and minds type mechanism, but there's a lot of variation we're going to see. Okay. All right. So now we're sort of trying to exploit this variation. So we have data for 34 of these blocks, and many fronts, of which the Frente José Luis Zuloaga was one of them. Okay. So in the case of McGeever, what you see is, it was very organized. They had this kind of organization, this organogramma. they provided public goods, they built schools and roads and a health clinic and all sorts of stuff. They bought musical instruments for the school, and so they provided public goods. They killed people, as well, they etc. All right. So one question you want to ask is, well, okay, so how representative is that, in terms of public good provision? Okay. How representative, I'm not going to show you any data on this, but one thing which is fascinating about this is that you want to ask, what about these organogrammas or estatutos? So one thing that the fiscales in charge of this transitional justice process were actually asked to do was to reconstruct these organogrammas. So what you see is there's a lot of variation in how these groups were organized, which is sort of fascinating. So there's a lot of interesting kind of social science questions about, how personalized were they, for example. So of course they were all pretty personalized. I think once you start reading about these fronts, you see that the reason that Maguiva had this model, and he was the chief, so he had a lot of influence. Isaza sort of basically Isaza was the head of the bloc, but he delegated a lot of authority to these different fronts. So there's a lot of variation in how they were organized, and some of them are much more personalized than others. What do I mean by personalized? Well, you could imagine, if I go back to the organogramma, for instance, if you look at Cuckoo Vanoi, I don't have Cuckoo Vanoi's organogramma here, but here Maguiva kind of, okay, yeah, he's the jefe, he's at the top here, but then there's a lot of he gives power to other people. So there's a lot of decentralization of authority, okay? Whereas in other organogrammas, everybody reports directly to the top. Like in Cuckoo Vanoi, everybody reports directly to Cuckoo Vanoi, okay? So there's no delegation. So Maguiva did a lot of delegation, but so there's a lot of variation in the organization, which I think is very interesting kind of intellectually, so we're still working on that. So I don't have anything to say about that. I'm just talking about how many interesting social science questions there are here. But obviously I want to ask, how representative is this? Maguiva provided all these public goods. How representative is that? How did he provide? Where did he get the resources? To build the roads? Well, he sent some people to Medellin, and they stole some road making equipment so he could build the roads. How did they get the money? They legally taxed farmers, and so I'm not. There's all sorts of questions here about where do the resources come from, but I'm just saying, the resources could have just been stolen, or they could have provided public goods. And okay, something about the social composition of the group and the leaders is kind of interesting. So one thing you see, so for example, we interviewed Maguiva a few times, and he's a very clever man. So he's not uneducated, school or something, but very clever. So if you ask him to explain the variation in these groups, he tells stories about people, like individuals' personalities, individuals' background, socialization. Yesterday I was talking about socialization. So that's what he told. He told stories about socialization. Okay, so you'll see in a minute, that's actually kind of inspired some of our hypotheses here, because how do you think about the variation? There's a lot of variation. Okay, and so what do I mean by the social composition of the group and leaders? Well, let me focus on the leaders. So the leaders could be campesino like him, or locals. So he was born in San Francisco, in the municipality of San Francisco, which was kind of part of his territory. Or they could be outsiders, or they could be much more educated. Mancuso, Mancuso went to university. He was a sort of elite. Jorge Cuarenta, he was like a local elite in Valledupar. So, they were much more elite. They were not campesino, they were more educated. So what's the consequence of having a more elite or educated leader for these groups as opposed to a campesino? But what about a military? What about a military man? So these were kind of military organizations as well, of course, and many of them were headed by blocks and also, fronts by former military people who'd, been in the army. So what's the consequence of having a military man in the army? And I think the military background of the leaders is particularly interesting because that tells you something about the connection to the Colombian state. Okay, so what you see just in the kind of, you know, in the testimony, in the judicial testimony, is that, you know, many of these groups were sort of formed, you know, with the encouragement of the government. So, you know, what the army, you know, so when I talked about Isaza, I said Isaza actually tried to get the army to help him, and they just told him to go away. They didn't have anything to do with him. And then it was subsequently, you know, these big landowners in Puerto Boyacá that sort of funded him and, you know, kind of started injecting resources into the group. But other groups were much more connected to the military. You know, they actually had ex-military people running them who were much more connected to the military. So that's an interesting source of variation as well. Like, what's the consequence of having this military background? Of course, Isaza did have a military background, but what's the, you know, but he wasn't a officer or a kind of, he didn't go to train, you know, he was just a kind of guy in the army, you know, sort of doing national service. What's the impact of this military background on people's behavior? And, you know, and using that as a way, I think, of, you know, what's difficult to get from this testimony is we know that there's all sorts of relationships with politicians and politics, but they don't want to talk about that. So it's very hard to get systematic evidence on that. So that's you know, that's difficult. So we only have a partial understanding of that, you know, because nobody wants to talk about that because, you know, there's too many powerful people interest involved. So when that comes up, they tend to sort of say, oh, I can't remember. I don't remember, you know, I don't remember who that was. I don't remember who we met with. I don't remember. So that we can't really code from the sources so far, at least from what we've seen. But we do know some things. We've been collecting this information on the heads, you know, the leaders of the different fronts, not blocks too, yeah, but there's you know, there's only 34 blocks we have data on. So there's not, you know, you can't do much kind of statistics with that. But we have about 120 fronts. So there's quite a lot, you know, there's a relatively large sample size, and, you know, there's a lot of variation in the characteristics of these people. Okay, so what's some hypothesis? I'll show you a little bit of data, and let me just think about some hypotheses. Okay, so you know, and so we have data on violence. We have a lot of data on violence. So obviously the fiscales have collected a lot of information on, you know, massacres, conflict with the guerrilla, conflict with the state, you know, displacement, and, you know, we can sort of triangulate this with other data sets that exist in Colombia, for example, from CINEP. So we want to look at violence. So we'd like to ask, you know, what characteristics of a front commander? I'm just going to, you know, I can do, we have all this data on all the demobilized. So in 2006, when they demobilized, the government actually collected all this information on the paramilitaries that demobilized. So we have all that data, but we're still playing with it. So let me just talk about the leaders. So we can compare the characteristics of the leaders to the extent of violence. So how violent was the group? You know, to what extent did they massacre civilians or displace civilians? You know, to what role did violence play? We can look at public good provision. So my discussion of McGeever was meant to motivate the state's not providing public goods, but some of these people are providing public goods as well. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, you know, about, you know, Cucu Vanoy, for example, built a hospital. You know, Vicente, the Castaño brothers provided public goods for sure. And, you know, and then the other thing you might be interested in is what about drugs? You know, so what about coca production? So we can also look at the extent to which these groups got involved in the drug business. Okay, so and I'm gonna throw out something which Jose and I are gonna kind of spend much more time talking about later on today, which is, you know, go back to I want to develop some hypotheses here and show you some data. And what hypotheses? The hypotheses are coming from this underlying model of there's a core and there's a periphery, and the core doesn't really want to rule the periphery. Okay, so why is that? We're going to talk more about that later today, but just take that as given for a moment. Like the core is really not interested in governing the periphery. The periphery is sort of self-governing and self-organizing, and it kind of interacts with the core through networks and connections. But the core is not interested in actually controlling or governing the periphery. Okay, so the core is drawn very reluctantly into the periphery. Okay, so that suggests the hypothesis to us, you know, that because the state doesn't want to govern the periphery, okay, a periphery, you know, which sort of organizes in a way which is more autonomous from the state, may actually generate better governance. Okay, what do I mean by better governance? I mean less violence, more public good provision, less involvement in the kind of drug dealing. Okay, what's drug dealing got to do with it? Well, it's actually, you know, just reading this testimony and sort of talking to these guys, you see that they all had this, they all think that essentially if you get involved in drug dealing, then you just lose focus on what you're trying to do. You know, what are you trying to do? You're trying to protect people, fight the FARC, you know, provide public goods or whatever, you know, like that people demand. And, you know, and once you get involved in drug dealing, you just basically like lose the plot. Okay, so that seems to be a correlation. Lots of people talk about that. The more kind of motivated people talk about that. So think about governance. You know, good governance is more public goods, less violence, less drug dealing, and so a natural hypothesis, you know, maybe inspired by this, but the Magdalena Medio example is, you know, if you're more autonomous from the state, governance is going to be better. Okay, and you know, sort of more precise things that you could look at in the data is, you know, is that it seems that groups run by locals, you know, just looking at the sort of raw data, you know, this is a kind of inductive research, which I like. I like inductive. Don't get me started on methodology, but you know, real social science is always very inductive. So you can see here, this is very inductive. We're kind of going backwards and forwards between these testimonies in the court proceedings and doing field work and then looking at the data. And so you know, one thing that comes out in the discussion is, you know, groups which are run by, you know, somebody from the area, like a local, they're much more likely to be associated with good governance than some outsider. Okay, so the second hypothesis, you know, is that somebody who's connected to the military are actually going to be associated with worse governance. Okay, and now let me just say something about the class structure. You know, so I talked about Megiva, Isaza, you know, who are sort of campesinos. And then you have other people, you know, like Ache, who are sort of military, or 00, you know, who are kind of former military people. But then, you know, so they're more connected to the state. But free class relations too, you know, Curso and Jorge 40, who were they? They were like upper class kind of elite people. And as Leopoldo sort of talked about, you know, elite people in Colombia don't have an interest in providing public goods. So you could sort of say there's three things here. You know, there's a group which is kind of with a military, you know, a former military man who are sort of connected to the state. That's more like the sort of, you know, outsourcing anti-subversive activities, you know. And then there are groups which are more autonomous from the state. But they can either be run by campesinos or someone like Isaza or Megiva or Hernan Giraldo or whatever in the Santa Marta, or they can be run by elites like Mancuso or Jorge 40, okay? But elites in Colombia tend not to be very interested in public good provision. So then the natural hypothesis would be, you know, well, actually fronts with more educate. So how do I measure elites? So the way we're going to do that is just by looking at education. So we have a lot of information about people's education. So what is it that distinguishes Mancuso from Megiva? Mancuso went to university. You know, he's an educated guy. So they're more educated people are associated with worse governance. But I think the way you want to think about that is just that's a way for us to identify who's an elite. You know, it's like campesino. Who's a campesino? It's not very well defined. You know, you could look at education. You know, we could look at their occupation. Like, what was their occupation before they became? So the court documents have a lot of information about people's kind of backgrounds, you know, and sometimes even what their parents did. So you know, we could say something about, you know, were they in an agricultural occupation before they joined the paramilitary? So that might be a way of kind of identifying who's a campesino. So let me just show you some data here to sort of think about these hypotheses. Okay, so this is public goods. So what we've been doing from the court documents essentially is sort of creating a data set of all the public goods in Colombia that were provided by these different paramilitary groups. And this is the, you know, was the front headed by a former military guy? Okay. Was the front headed by someone who worked in agriculture prior to, you know, joining the paramilitaries? Was it headed by someone who was born in a kind of rural municipality? That's another way of trying. We know where they were born, you know, so we can look at whether it was urban or rural. This one is the most interesting, which is that, you know, was the front commander born in a municipality where the front operated? So what we have is, you know, we have very detailed information about where these different blocks and fronts operated. So, you know, go back to my MacGyver example. We know MacGyver was born in San Francisco, and that was part of the territory of his front. So that would be like a 1, you know, if the commander was actually a sort of local person. Okay, so and this is, you know, public goods just kind of normalized by population. So you could do that in different ways. And this is just like trying to count the number of public goods. Did they build bull rings or schools or roads or hospitals or things like that? Okay, and you know, this is sort of noisy, but what you see is that, you know, it's a bit noisy. We're working on that, but what you see is that fronts with a commander, you know, who was a local, seemed to be much more likely to provide public goods than fronts who had a military guy running them. Okay, so they're more, you know, these are sort of, think of these as, you know, coming from the outside. You know, these fronts are being sort of created to fight against the guerrilla, but they're not, you know, they're not embedded in the local community in the same way, and they're not going to have the same preferences with respect to public good provision. Okay, so there's one result we have, but they're much more likely to engage in massacres. Okay, so now think of the outcome variable as massacres, you know, perpetrated against civilians, and this one is very significant. If you have a military guy running the front, that front is much more likely to commit massacres against civilians. And in fact, across the board, all measures of sort of violence are worse when there was a military person in charge. Okay, and I want you to think that, you know, these are the people who are more connected. They've been socialized by the state. And what does the state want to do? It wants to pacify. It wants to pacify the periphery. You know, think about this business in San Jose de Guaviare, like, what was that, 6 months ago or something, where the FARC, these dissidents from the FARC, were recruiting children. You know, what did the Colombian government do? Bombed the heck out of them. You know, children and all and everybody. You know, that's how you know, you want to pass. You don't want to govern the periphery. You just pacify it. Okay, so here's you deal with it. That's what was Mancuso and Baez and Izaza doing in the Colombian Congress. They were negotiating. You were negotiating. So this is worse governance with the military, less public goods, more violence. You know, and I'm going to show you just one more thing. Okay, here's the hectares of, you know, here's the cocaine. Think of this as cocaine production. So hectares of cocaine, all right, by the educational level of the commander. So what you see is that, you know, if you have a university education, you're much more likely to be producing coca than if you have, you know, like incomplete, so less educated people are much less likely to get involved in drug dealing than more educated people. As I said, the way I'm thinking about this is just in terms of elite. Okay, so this is, you know, so I think, you know, the way you know, you could think about this data or this experience in Colombia from different angles, you know, but the way we want to think about it is it's a sort of perspective, you know, and I say a perspective, you know, I use the word perspective in a kind of significant way because I'm sort of saying we're looking at the Colombian state from a particular angle. Okay, that's a perspective. We can't see all of the interactions and we can't see all of the mechanisms going on, but we can see something about what goes on in this periphery and this organization and the consequences of the interaction with the state and what does it mean for sort of governance. Okay, and you know, and I think there's some sort of interesting ideas there about, you know, the circumstances under which, you know, it's difficult to, you know, why did some front get run by the military or some front get run by a campesino? And so the way we're going to think about saying something more causal, you know, again, is by comparing these front territories and looking at the boundaries and doing sort of regression discontinuity, you know, because if we have a front with a campesino, you know, next to a front with a military guy or an elite guy, you know, then we can think of like looking at sort of estimating something more causal. I'm just showing you the descriptive statistics there, so that's not very causal, but you know, so you can think of all sorts of problems of inference here, which I'm not getting into, but I want you to think of that as being, and we're going to have more examples today, as okay, in this periphery, there's all sorts of scope for different things. Like look at Megiva or Isaza, you know, they had this project, they got organized, you know, they started taxing, they started providing public goods, you know, they sort of, you know, they dealt with the state, they interacted with local politicians and in the army in different ways, but they had their kind of project, you know, they had their organograma, they had their estatutos, they had this project, you know, and who stopped that? No, nobody stopped it. It just happened, okay? And so I think you want to kind of think there's all this freedom and there are these spaces, you know, out there. And that's actually an interesting thing. And maybe there were massacres and violence and too, you know, but maybe there's scope for other things other than massacres and violence. And I guess that's you know, that's what I want you to start thinking. Okay, so now I'm going to get, you know, hopefully Jose will stop talking soon. I'm talking too much, you know, but so I want you that image in your mind now, okay? Because now I want to start, we're going to build on that. And that's kind of, you know, I begin with this because this is where Jose and I kind of started intellectually, you know, which is that one of the problems with the Engelman and Sokolov approach or the Why Nations Fail approach or whatever is there are elites, you know, and elites have extractive institutions and they create inequality and, you know, but that picture that I just painted of peripheral Colombia, like where are the elites? You know, where, you know, like they are there, but is that under control? Who has, you know, who had Isaza under control? You know, not you know, who had Mancuso under control? You know, nobody in Bogota, you know, like they negotiated, they had to cope with it. They had to, you know, so where's the hegemony of the elite? You know, so in the Engelman and Sokolov and Why Nations Fail, there's this elite and the elite are hegemonic and they're kind of controlling everything. But that's not the picture that comes out of Colombian paramilitarism. It's a much more bottom-up, spontaneous, self-organizing situation. It's not under the control of elites. The elites negotiate. And I think that's a much better, more accurate picture of what goes on in these societies, okay? But I think once you get that image in your mind, you sort of see a lot of things might be possible that are not evident from this model of the hegemonic Engelman and Sokolov elite and extractive institutions, okay? And that's what we're going to start by thinking about, okay? So here's a roadmap, which is, you know, so I'm first going to argue, and this is in the paper that Jose, that's kind of it's on my webpage that Jose and I wrote last year, is actually, you know, these ungoverned spaces leave a lot of room for non-elite mobilization to occur with different sorts of projects. You know, Megiva even had a kind of pretty constructive project we're going to give you some other very concrete examples of that. All right. Of course, that can be violent and it can be perverse, you know, and you know, you could sort of say, you know, the big picture about Colombian paramilitarism is it was a disaster for the country, and I think that's right, you know, but it doesn't have to be like that. Okay, and we're going to give some examples from Bolivia and, you know, maybe Argentina in a perverse way. We're going to make a sort of, we're going to make an argument about Peronism, which we think is interesting too. And then Peru, José is from Peru, so he's going to talk about Peru, where all sorts of interesting things are happening in these ungoverned spaces. So I think you want to think, you know, the agenda here is, let's think about Latin America in a different way, how Latin America could change. And a lot of political economy is about, you know, randomized corruption audits and all of that stuff. And I guess, you know, I started today by saying, there's a lot of limitations in that agenda. You know, maybe it'll work, maybe it'll accumulate into something, but, you know, after random corruption audits, we had Odebrecht, you know. So let's think about it in a different way. And the way we're going to think about it is just to say, yeah, look, actually, there's all these spaces, you know, things are not so hegemonic, they're more fluid and open, and people can solve the collective action problem, and they can organize with different sorts of projects. And not everything is like, you know, the Colombian paramilitaries. It's an interesting example, but think about the cocoleros in Bolivia. You know, what elite stopped the cocoleros organizing? They couldn't. The cocoleros organized. They created a political party, the MAS. What did the MAS do? The MAS took over the state. Okay, so there's an example of a social movement forming in the periphery, a political project forming in the periphery that took over the state. Where were the Bolivian elites? Who stopped that? Okay, so that's a very interesting example, and we'll show you some of the consequences of that. I've actually been studying that with Carlos Molina and Pablo Zelaya, this Bolivian collaborator of mine. Okay, so that's going to be the first sort of new argument, which sort of says there's much more scope for change in Latin America than it looks like with this sort of standard Engelman and Sokolov type story. So let's give some examples and let's think about that. Okay, so this might be a much more potent source of change than marginal improvements of institutions or corruption audits. Okay, the second big argument we're going to come with, which is, you know, which we don't have a paper, but we have a presentation, is about, okay, so that's one thing that the Engelman and Sokolov type paradigm doesn't explain very well. Here's something else, you know, and we're going to give you a whole bunch of examples about puzzling things in Latin America that can't really be explained by this hegemonic sort of narrative. And we're going to develop a different way of thinking about the state. This is this Unreal Ideas project. And what we're going to argue is that there's a fundamental sort of disequilibrium at work in Latin American state-society relations, and that's very deeply rooted in I think, like we think culturally in Latin America, but it puts a very, once you see that, it puts a very different perspective on things than this remorseless focus on kind of power relations. All right, so that's going to be the second kind of argument, and then in the end, if I have time, I'm going to make a third argument about why you might be, how you could think about Latin America in a different way. In particular, how can you think about patrimonialism in a different way? You know, so you know, yesterday I was talking about, you know, if you think about this divergence in the Americas, you know, how could I think about the mechanisms generating that? Well, democracy was long delayed in Latin America compared to North America, and not just that. You know, when it finally arrived, it was low quality. You know, the state was weak and democracy was clientelistic. So, you know, when I talk about Pablo's paper about Vietnam, it's like Weberian rational legal state good, patrimonial state bad. Okay, so I'm going to end today. You know, this is very recent research that I've been doing in Rwanda in East Africa with a collaborator of mine, Leander Heldring, is that, you know, working in Rwanda, we sort of realized, like, there's something fundamentally misleading about this image people have of clientelism. So that that's some work I'm very excited about, and I'll talk, you know, and I think but it has enormous implications for Latin America, it seems to me. So I'll talk about that at the end. So think about this as, you know, this is going to be based on kind of three sets of ideas to get you thinking differently about Latin America. The elites are not so hegemonic. There's all sorts of space for doing different things. There's a fundamental disequilibrium in state-society relations in Latin America, we're going to describe. And that also leads to all sorts of new possibilities. And then the last thing is patrimonialism may be different from what, it may create possibilities that you never thought about before, especially if you've read the political economy literature. Okay, so I think we should probably have a coffee break, or I should have a coffee break, and then let's have a coffee break for 10 minutes, something like that, and then Jose and I will start talking. I think that sounds reasonable. Does that sound reasonable, Jose?
Sounds perfect.
Okay,
perfect. Yeah.
Did I talk too long?
No, it was excellent.
Okay, so let's have coffee and sort of what do they call it, mental health break, and then we come back in 10. We'll start talking again. Let's say in 10 minutes, 10:42.
Wonderful, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
al horario de la vieja. Están como de vacaciones.
All right, I think I'm ready to start talking again. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So
Yes.
some of this, let me just jump a bit because maybe this is going to be too repetitive, and I don't want to. I think I've made the point here. So Leopoldo talked about our weak state trap paper, where we collected this data on the extent of clientelism and tax evasion in Colombia. And I just want to show you, I don't know if he showed you the map. So here's the map, which is sort of interesting. So darker, so here the left map is tax evasion, and the right map is clientelism, and darker means more tax evasion. So where's more tax evasion? Well, like Guajira, Sucre, Cordoba, the usual suspects, Norte de Santander, Meta. Yeah, there's a bit of, there's one of the things I point out in my paper, The Misery of Colombia, that this sort of core periphery has this kind of fractal, it has this sort of fractal quality, so there are cores and peripheries, but within cores, there are cores and peripheries. And of course, within Bogota, there are cores and peripheries. So it's an interesting kind of thing. So, but I think like, what you see here, on this map is, Putumayo, I guess it's Nariño, almost Putumayo, is that, you can see kind of just visually the correlation between tax evasion on the left and clientelism on the right. The places where with their tax evasion, Sucre, Cordoba, Guajira, Meta, the Norte de Santander, they tend to be the places with higher clientelism. But again, the darker places tend to be in this sort of peripheral Colombia, just to sort of go back to that, on this map. And so I kind of made this argument, but, here's quoting, CLR James's famous book, The Black Jacobins, about the Haitian Revolution. He makes this point about, some sense the French planters were sleeping on the edge of Vesuvius, and when the Haitian Revolution, Vesuvius exploded. So I guess the idea that Jose and I have in mind here is to sort of say, are Latin American elites sleeping on the edge of Vesuvius? And I guess you could say, well, we know that they are potentially from the Cuban Revolution, or the Mexican Revolution, but edge of Vesuvius, is all much more fragile than it appears to be from this sort of hegemonic narrative of divergence and persistence and extractive institutions. And I think there's lots of examples of that, we talked about that. I want you to think about the paramilitaries from that perspective. There's other ways of thinking about that, but I think that's one way of thinking about it. We like this example of John Calzones, John Torres. So who was John, so this is, I talked about this, this is another example of, the Colombian periphery, back to Yopal. Who was John Calzones? John Calzones he was a businessman. He made money selling ladies' underwear, hence his nickname. And what did he do? He made some money. Then what did he do? Well, he started a barrio. Here it is, La Ciudadela La Bendición. Okay, he took over this piece of land in Yopal and he started building infrastructure. Look, you can see electricity. He built sewer, water. And then he gave people subsidies to build houses. So what was he doing? He was creating a social base. He was providing public goods. And then what did he do? Well, then he ran for politics, the Movimiento Social La Bendición. And it says here, no más corrupción, somewhere or other. No más corrupción. There we are. So that was his platform. He ran for mayor of Yopal. So this is this is the same sort of thing. The government doesn't do much. There's no, doesn't provide public goods, power, running water, so you have to provide your own, and somebody has to organize to provide public goods to form a kind of social base. And then what do you do? Well, you could, McGeever and some people, they wanted to stay away from politics, well, you could get involved in politics. So here he gets involved in politics and, you sort of mediate. This is the mediation between the core and the periphery. Okay. But this is our first example. But there's other examples of this going on all over the place in Latin America. So I already mentioned the cocaleros, and I wasn't going to show you regressions. I could show you regressions, but I don't think we'd have time. But let me just show you this one picture from the World Bank, on the Gini coefficient in Bolivia. Okay, so here's the rise of the cocaleros start before this, but here's the rise of the mass and the capture of the state by the mass. And you can see that what's happened in Bolivia since the takeover of the state by the mass there's been a dramatic fall in inequality. So there's been all sorts of other things too. There's been a big increase in social mobility, especially of indigenous people, and there's been a huge empowerment of indigenous people. So this is exactly an example of what CLRJ was talking about. So the Paseño elites, they were sleeping on the edge of Vesuvius, and when the periphery got organized, when the cocaleros got organized, when indigenous people got organized, they swept into power, and that's had dramatic effects on Bolivian society in a much more inclusive way. If you go to La Paz now, you can see there's just an explosion of indigenous society and indigenous culture, and and that society is dramatically changing in a much more inclusive way. And it's exactly something which formed in the periphery, in the Chapare Valley, and spread and coagulated and captured the state. Okay, so this is a super interesting example. This is not like the paramilitaries. It's not so violent. It's a much more peaceful, collective political project. But there's no reason why this couldn't happen. Not indigenous based in the same way, but the point is there's plenty of spaces for different things like this to happen in Colombia too. The other example we give in the paper, is the Peronists. So for all the faults of Peronism and all the bad things you could say about Peronism, at some level, Peronism really was a sort of dramatically anti-elite movement. It's not just the rhetoric of Peron, but many of the things that happened in the Peronist period were aggressively and avowedly anti-elite. The whole emphasis on the descamisados, and Peron, like John Calzones, a little bit bigger scale and more ambitious, built a social movement on non-elite grounds, and he captured the state. Okay, here's a famous image of Peronism as a social revolution. Peronism wasn't just some elite kind of plot; it was a social revolution. And this is a famous photograph of the Peron supporters, the descamisados, with their suits on, because one has to wear a suit, but then paddling outside the palace, the Casa Rosada, so here's the presidential palace, but a kind of proper person doesn't roll their trouser legs up and paddle in the pool, so there's a sort of, they've got a suit on, but they don't really know how to behave, because they're non-elite, because they're from the interior, and Peronism was a fascinating coalition of people from the interior with working class people from Buenos Aires and from the core. So it was people from the periphery, but also in a coalition with people from the core. So again, not an elite project, which dramatically captured the state. Now you could sort of say, well, this wasn't quite so good as the Cocaleros, was it? Yeah, I don't think so. It wasn't quite so good, but it did have a big impact on inequality. So the data, this is the data on the income distribution suggests that, for all its sins, Peronism really was a kind of radical project in the sense of sort of leveling social differences and redistributing. So maybe it had all sorts of bad incentive effects in other dimensions. And obviously it's a very kind of Manichean identity like Chavismo, it's sort of like them and us. It's a very polarizing kind of, and maybe that's part of this Latin American problem, that there are spaces, but the spaces tend to generate particular sorts of oppositional political programs which don't have such great effects for the equilibrium. That's not, I think in the Bolivian case, that's not the case. But in many of these cases, I mean, again, Chavismo is an interesting example of a non-elite movement that captured the state. But so I think like these things don't always end well. You could sort of say Peronism hasn't necessarily been fantastic for Argentina. I think it depends what dimension you're talking about. In many ways, Argentina is a fundamentally much more egalitarian society than Colombia is, for instance. It's much less hierarchical and more kind of open than in a kind of social way than Colombia is, or even Chile. If you go back and think about this discussion of Zimmerman's work, you don't have that in Argentina, that kind of thing that he's talking about. So that's, maybe there's trade-offs. We're not defending Peronism. We're just pointing out that there's a very interesting aspect of Peronism, which is actually very inconsistent with this sort of hegemonic narrative. So there's room for maneuver here. There's degrees of freedom which might not be evident. Okay. So I don't want to, we talk about it in the paper. There's a very interesting scholarly literature about the culture of Peronism. Peronism was a culture. It was an identity. It's a very complicated political phenomenon, Peronism, because it was an identity. It was something that emerged in these spaces, in Buenos Aires, in barrios, or in the interior, and it tapped into all sorts of different aspects of Argentine culture, non-elite culture. I guess that's the point. All right. So there's all sorts of things happening in Latin America, and sometimes they end up in a very good place, like in Bolivia. So I'm going to show the video. Is that a good idea, Jose?
That's excellent. An excellent idea.
So let me give you another example, and then Jose is going to start talking about. No, let me not screw this up. Hold on, if you'll pardon my French. Let me hold on a second. This is it. This is what I want to do. Okay, can you see that? Is that working?
Yes, excellent.
Todo peruano, por el solo hecho de ser peruano, tiene derecho a gozar de lo maravilloso que es ser peruano.
Volume.
Perú, 569 habitantes, un grifo, un restaurante, una avenida, un banco, un museo, una estación de tren que, bueno, ahora sirve para otros fines, su escuela, su tanque de agua, su alcaldía y un sheriff cuyo último trabajo fue separar a un perro de un gato en 1998. Perú, Nebraska, tiene un problema. Son peruanos, pero no saben qué significa serlo.
Listo, muchachos, digamos. Vamos, vamos, Cristian. Vamos, dale.
Oye, ¿y dónde me llegado?
Nuestra misión es ser embajadores de nuestro país y leerles sus derechos como peruanos.
Ustedes son de Perú. Tienen derecho a comer rico. Ustedes son de Perú.
¿Quieren probar? You can try it. What do you call this?
Chicha morada.
Chicha.
Huancaína. Huancaína.
Huancaína.
Ya. Yuca. Yuca. Aceituna.
Tuna?
Aceituna.
What is that?
Is that enough?
Yeah, I think that will be enough. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I will start sharing then my screen then.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll start sharing my screen here. You see the screen here?
I can see it. Yeah.
Yeah, you guys can see it. Very good. Perfect. Thank you so much, James, for this. It's always a pleasure. What we have been discussing with James, and I'm just going to not only touch base on something that he stressing something that he has already talked about in the case of Peronismo, I mean, in a way in which there is this construction of a sort of a national, proto-national identity, or like, very culturally driven, in a sort of way. We wanted to also offer the case of Peru. I mean, obviously has differences from the one that, that happened in Argentina starting in the 1930s, and 40s, but obviously, there is some sort of similitude to it, that has to do with a particular type of emergence of a new culture, and the video that you have just saw basically is one of the videos that, in which Peru was trying to position itself, in the mid to early 2000s, at the beginning of the middle of the last decade, in which, in order to be able to promote the culture, promote the country around the globe, after like the war, after the war had finished, and in the upswing of the commodity prices of the big cycle that happened 10 years ago, in terms of economic terms, and the country, to become also a receptor of tourism. But what is interesting, I think, and what really became so fascinating for myself and James is that this was coded in a very particular way. And this was coded, the way in which the country was presented obviously, by the food. That was one of the most famous examples. And I think if you're all in Bogota, or wherever in Colombia, you can always find a good Peruvian restaurant. It has become some sort of very particular way of understanding how the country has come together, quote unquote. So how does this happen? Obviously, every single country in Latin America has this level of mestizaje to some degree, but there were few countries that really took this on. Obviously the first one was Mexico. Mexico was the country, Mexico and Dominican Republic probably are the two main countries in which, you know, you have this notion of mestizaje as central to the national identity. And of course, in the case of Mexico, well, we can talk about Vasconcelos and La Raza Cósmica. In Peru, this has happened too. Peru was known as el país de todas las sangres, you know, the country of all type of bloods, you know, because of the immigration of the Japanese immigration, the Chinese immigration, on top of the African Peruvian and the large Andean population there too. So as well, of course, as the criollo and white elite derived from the Spanish, Italians, and other types of European immigrations. So what happens in Peru basically due to this strange correlation between countryside or basically interior or provinces and the center, you know, obviously little by little, the cities were starting to get a large number of immigrants from the Andes. And that created in itself, within Lima is a city that has around 12 million people. It's large. I mean, Peru is a smaller country than Colombia, but Lima is larger than Bogota. You know, that says something about it. I mean, it's a large country, and it's a large city, and because it's in the middle of the desert, you know, you have the extension is very, very long. But what you have is basically there is that, like, you know, since basically the 50s, you had a very interesting process of mestizaje. I mean, from the top down, not necessarily from the top up, like in the case of Mexico. In Mexico, it was something that was promoted by the elites, and then everything conformed that to some degree, you know, and the state conformed to that. And of course, that mestizaje had Project Mestizaje had a lot of problems, especially since the 90s with the Zapatistas, you know, in the 90s, and we can discuss that later, you know, too. But the point here is that in the case of Peru, there have been an incredible and very particular type of mixing to some degree that has, as is clear in the screen, you know, I mean, not just Criollo, but also Asian and European and African. Everything has been mixed, and of course, the Peruvian cuisine as a world phenomenon is perhaps the most important manifestation of it. You know, for 50 years, you basically have had, you know, this creation of this. People will come from different parts of the Andes and different parts of the country, ended up living together, you know, in the outskirts of Lima and producing something that more or less now is called, what is called is la cultura chola. And that's why we put this slide called El Laberinto de la Choledad, because, you know, what exactly means to be cholo in El Peru is a complicated situation. It used to be a derogatory term. It used to mean at some point el indio who was not part of the Andean, who was not part of his culture anymore in the Andes, but actually came to the city. That was a cholo. So basically implied a sort of emptiness of culture. But little by little, that culture started to grow and start to become extremely powerful. And now what you have is basically a cholo culture, which is the representation of that mestizo identity, has been basically produced over 70, 80 years, you know, almost a century in the outskirts of Lima and in the outskirts of all the big cities in the coast in Peru. Now, this has brought, I mean, as you say, that the food is a very common, but this has not only been presented in terms of the food that you more or less know already, you know, and you probably have agree with me that it's delicious, but also, if you see it in terms of the racial makeup of the people in the region in Lima, you could see the very big difference and the real type of mestizaje and change of color of the economical elite. Here, what we have here is the, for example, what in Peru, copying what the Venezuelans used to have in the 1980s, you know, when I think I mean, in Venezuela, this started, you know, as knowing the 12 or the group of real big empresarios, you know, that were close to the government. You know, they used to call them the apostles, los 12 apóstoles, you know. And in Peru, we had one. Peru has always had, you know, this group of very, very wealthy people who are very close to the government. And when Alan Garcia in 1986, you know, in 1985, 86, decided to basically estatize, you know, the banca, you know, nationalize the banking system, you know, he basically was in a rift with these 12 apóstoles that he had tried to basically cattle and, you know, and maintain very close to him. So that's why, you know, we had a cut. You know, it was clear who was in and out. The 12 apóstoles, if you can even see the names, Lanata Piaggio, Olechea, Picasso Salinas, Raffo, Vice, Delgado Parker, Brescia, Bentin, these are all names of basically, I mean, the Western white oligarchy, put it that way. You know, I mean, the descendants of Westerners coming to Peru, always having the top positions, usually Germans, English, Italians, and Spanish, you know, which then, you know, had incredible success in businesses, you know, and that's what you have, your Nicolini, Ferreiros, you know, all that. If you move forward to 2020, because this series of measurements have been conducted continuously, you know, you will see that there is a very clear difference. Of course, there are people who remain there, the ones that have been savvy enough in order to transform the country, and the ones who have basically sustained, you know, their wealth through, especially mining, you know, who has not changed much. Benavides, the very famous one, the Benavides family, or the Brescia family, the Romero being the owners of a big bank, you know, but the rest, and in general, if you can see Huancaruna, Añaños, Acuña, all those names, or Rodriguez in Gloria, you know, you could see that those are not names that are quote unquote Western, or they're quote unquote the typical 12 apóstoles. Something has happened here. And you can see that the phenotypes are very clear. You know, a good chunk of them, a good fourth of those of the richest people in Peru are no longer, you know, just the typical white guy, you know, are actually, you know, people who have been growing provinciano, going from being in the province, but then moving to a big city or moving to Lima and starting from there. And they do derive into this new idea of the Cholo culture, of this Cholo culture that is now, you know, taking over the country, and in which everything is working in that regard. You know, here is a little bit in terms of, like, you know, comparison to what we were talking about, like, you know, with La Raza Cósmica in Mexico, in Vasconcelos, you know, of Mexico. But, you know, the truth is that there is something has changed dramatically, you know, in Peru. And is it either, what are we catching up with, mestizaje finally catching up, or what I think we're suggesting, what we were suggesting with James, is there is a new composition. There is a new composition that the elites did not handle, because if not, they would have just maintained the 12 wild guys, you know. But something changed. There is a magma underneath in order to maintain the notion of the Vesuvius underneath. I mean, the metaphor of the Vesuvius. There is a magma there that, you know, that actually did create a tectonic shift here, you know. And and that has been the creation of a new identity in which lots of people can recognize yourself in the same way that we talk about, for example, the food. Why do you like a lomo saltado? Well, I like a lomo saltado because the lomo saltado implies that, you know, we have the Spanish type of onion and the little cut, I mean, the Asian fusion with, you know, some sort of the potatoes, which are basically Andean, and the camote, which is the same. So all these things, you know, come to fruition or come to be coalesced in some sort of dish. It's exactly the same thing that is happening here in this larger purview in this notion of cholo culture that has now basically transformed the country into one that, you know, nowadays you cannot say that it's only just the white guy, the rich white limeño guy. Half, I mean, a quarter of them, to sometimes, and probably in the very near future, will be half of them will be provincianos, will actually come from a complete different culture and a complete different type of phenotype, if you want to put it that way. So in which you can identify in a different way. So I don't know if you want to. I want to pass it to James to continue with the part of the next paper. And should I just stop sharing my screen, James?
No, because you're gonna let me say a few things, and then you're gonna talk about the first example, which is about,
that's right.
Yeah. So I think, like, so that's, you know, so that's, yesterday I was talking about, you know, sociological mechanisms for the sort of persistence of the Latin American equilibrium. But now what Jose is talking about is, you know, sociological mechanisms, you know, which is sort of dissolving that equilibrium in Peru. You know, so we're so fixated on institutional change and institutional reforms and anti-corruption audits and all of that, that, you know, we you know, or Odebrecht or whatever, you don't see all this social change, which is sort of dramatically reorganizing society. And that's going on under the noses of the elite, you know, in the same way that the organization of the cocaleros went on under the noses of the Bolivian elite, so that this is just another example of, you know, things, very interesting, much more inclusive things happening in Latin America, you know. But so now we're going to talk about the we'll come back to that thought. We're going to talk about our sort of new project, which I think is even more kind of radical in its orientation, which we call Unreal Ideas. And so we're going to motivate this with 3 examples of things that we don't think you can explain with the standard political economy approach. And the first example is from Peru, right?
Exactly. Yes, I'm going to. Okay. Very good. Thank you, James. And that, I mean, let me say that, you know, this one, yeah, as James says, is a little bit even more radical what we are trying to say here. In relation to the standard type of interpretation. So let me tell you a story. Let me start with a story. As you know, Peru was the last country to get independence in Latin America, in South America, because, you know, Bolivar and San Martin had to go and basically, you know, make it independent because the seat of the Spanish government was there. So the point is that this year, it was in 1821, really the real independence actually ended up in 1823, 1824, you know, with Ayacucho, you know. But the point is, this year is official independence of, the official 200-year independence of Peru, Bicentenario. And because of that, there is a very famous, the country wanted to really do something big for the Bicentenario, and that Bicentenario was going to have a project of long exhibitions, you know, about obviously Peru, and about our 200 years. So usually, what is done in this case, in the case of the state, is basically they have a concurso, you know, they have a contest, you know, they open up proposals, you know, in order to be able to have to have projects that were actually going to have a winner. And here, after a year search, of all the projects, looking at what the projects were, what you had is basically finally someone was declared a winner, my friend Miguel. My friend Miguel Lopez, a famous curator in Peru, was the winner of the competition. The problem was that he really wasn't the real winner, quote unquote. There were 120 projects presented, but 119 were all disqualified. I mean, he was not really the only, he was not the only winner. He was not really the winner. He was actually, even in the finalists, 5 of them were disqualified for technicalities. His project won because he was the only project that was considered apt. An apt doesn't necessarily mean to be a winner. It was the only one which passed all the requirements, and that's why they had to consider him and declare him the winner. There was no one else. In other words, he won because, for walkover, I don't know, I mean, we say that, in sports terms, but basically he won because no one else competed, because out of 120 presentations, 119 were disqualified. Can you consider that a winner? That's a question that we have here. The situation was so absurd that he was very saddened about, and he, instead of celebrating, he was apologetic about the whole thing and saddened. And instead of salento, siento mucho, that's what he said, siento mucho también verme en medio de una situación no solicitada, tan solo por el hecho de ser parte del equipo que fue declarado apto, el único equipo a nuestro pesar y gran decepción. So he's basically the way that he comes out, I mean, when he is declared a winner, instead of basically making a declaration of what he's going to do, all his plans, is basically completely apologetic in terms of saying, listen, I won because I was the only one who came with who was apt, because all the other ones were disqualified. Now, this notion of descalificación técnica in politics has been going on in Peru forever, as you may know. The most famous case, I mean, in politics in Peru, has been going on in which, in 2016, in the Peruvian presidential election, 1 month before the voting, Julio Guzman, who was in 2nd place and who supposedly was going to win the election, and Cesar Acuña, who was in 5th place, were disqualified on mere technicalities, while they let run candidates which were in prison, because they did not have any problem with technicalities, quote unquote. So this notion of descalificación técnica has been, it is pervasive, and it's almost a continuous use of it, in a very particular, in very specific ways. La revocatoria, to revocate to repeal the mandate of someone, it is another common use, another common practice in Peru. I think that I remember that Susana Villarán, as you may know, in 2013, who was the mayor of Lima, had an attempt of having a repeal of her mandate, because she was from the left. Something similar as happened, I think, to Petro not long ago. Remember, But Peru was already the world champion of repealings of these mandates, with 277, majors that were already repealed in 15 years, So since the law was established in 1997, you had until 2013 almost 4,500 cases, of repealing of mandates. So basically, whoever didn't like, if you didn't like that such and such won the election, what you could do is simply collect signatures, get an X number of signatures, and then repeal the mandate. I mean, was that formal? Yes, formally it is acceptable, but it is never used, and that's, of course, you can have that, in terms of the number of the Peruvian legal instability has been one that has been pervasive there too. I mean, as you know, in Peru in the last years, and right now we don't even have a president. This a result of this. In Peru, in 4 years, Peru has had 4 presidents. We're in the last 2 weeks of Sagasti right now. Hopefully, he will sustain himself until then. But we still do not have. In 2 weeks, there has to be a transition of government. And they do not have a declared winner yet, and they probably will have a declared winner in next week. We've only given for the transition of the government only 3 or 4 days. So you can see how that sets up problems, again, because of technical issues, because of technical difficulties, because of, this is not the way this should be. Something is going on there, in order to be able, in order to show to show that, what you have here is basically, a very, very clear appeal to a type of the letter of the law, but not basically the spirit of it. And I don't know if James wants to enter here to go from here, and then I will continue, or
Yes. Okay. Good. Yes. Let's do that. So why don't you stop shit?
Yeah.
You're going to stop sharing, and I'm going to share.
Yeah.
If I can find the right.
73. Yeah.
Okay. No, yeah. Let me go down. Can you see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. So there's that's our first example. Okay, and so here's the second. There's going to be 3 examples, and here's the second one, and the second one comes from a fantastic ethnography by Javier Aullero, who's an Argentine sociologist at University of Texas at Austin. And all his books are absolutely fantastic. But he has one book called The Patience of the State. And the Patience of the State is a sort of ethnography of how the state interacts with its citizens in Argentina. So he's an anthropologist, he's a sociologist, but he's an ethnographer. So he uses a kind of ethnographic method. So he observes and he interviews people in where people are waiting for the state, they're trying to get services, they're trying to get attention. He sits in these waiting rooms and he interviews people, and he observes what's going on, the interaction between people and the state. And so the description of that is like Jose sort of said, that first example, this example, in Peru, it's sort of, there's just something very dysfunctional going on there. It's not clear like how to characterize that, but there's something very dysfunctional. And that's exactly what Aullero depicts in this Patience of the State. Okay, so and why patience? Why patient? Why a patience of the state? Aren't they citizens? Well, no, because they're almost like patients waiting to be treated by a doctor. So here's Leticia. So Leticia is an aspirant for Nuestras Familias. So this is a sort of a conditional cash transfer program. There are there are criteria, either you're eligible for it or you're not eligible for it, but of course that's not quite as simple as that. Okay, she's by herself, standing alone at the back of the room. She's come to the office 3 times in the last 3 weeks. I'm used to waiting. I have to wait everywhere. The worst thing is they make you go here and there. I came 2 weeks ago. They told me to come back in 3 days. I came back. The office was closed. I returned the next day. They said, there's no funds in the program. You wait because that's how things are here. Okay. You have to come back many times because if you don't show up, you won't get anything. I think here we are. Maria. They delay attending to you. They don't listen to you. They're there, but they don't listen to you. They don't pay attention to you. The interviewer, this is Auyero, or one of his research assistants. They're eating breakfast, or they drink mate, eat cookies. They talk a lot amongst themselves. And how do you get their attention? No, I wait for them to assist me. You just wait for them to pay attention to you? Yes, you have to wait. Of all the times you've gone, do you remember there was someone, making a commotion? Oh yes, a patient fought shouting. A patient? What kind of patient? A health patient? No, a patient. A woman who waited. So the patience of the state comes comes from people's own description of their interaction with the state. And this book, you might think, oh, this is about corruption or something, but it isn't. In fact, corruption, nobody asks for a bribe, and there's no discussion of corruption. It's just this incredibly dysfunctional interaction between the state and the people, because there are these things. You're a citizen, and citizens have rights. They have rights to receive nuestras familias, or a particular policy, or a service, or to get a driving license, or an ID, or a passport, or whatever. But the state can't get organized to actually provide such a thing. So there's a sort of disequilibrium between the rights you're supposed to have, the services a modern state is supposed to provide, and the actual organization, which can't actually provide that and can't open on time or anything else. Okay, so there's our second example. The Auyero's paper. There's a whole book, and there's a paper, but there's a book. But the book is much better because it's more rich empirically. But the paper shows you the idea. It's this frustrating disequilibrium between the state and society. And so here's the third example, which is a Colombian example. You can see I couldn't resist this. Alcaldía de Cabullaro. Buenos tiempos para todos. You in Meta, yes, you can imagine buenos tiempos para todos in Meta. Okay, so let me tell you about Cabullaro, and this is a fascinating example, again, a Colombian example of this disequilibrium. Okay, and it's in the context of land reform and the distribution of land, and this is from a Human Rights Watch report about the distribution of land, in El Carpintero, which is a vereda in Cabullaro, with good times for everybody. Okay, and so let me give you a little description of this land reform, how land reform works in the periphery. So I've given you the sort of, I talked about Rio Paila and Sarmiento, so that's the sort of traditional narrative about what goes on in the Colombian periphery. Connected elites game land reform laws in order to expropriate land, and that goes on. We know it goes on, but other things go on too, and now we're focusing on the other things. So let me tell you this story of what happens in El Carpintero. In 1997, Incora decides it's going to give 85 people land titles in El Carpintero. Okay, and here's somebody talking about one of the campesinos who received the land. They were going to give us an agricultural project, okay? Because El Carpintero, what's in El Carpintero in Meta? You can imagine there's no roads, there's no infrastructure. You start growing crops. How do you sell them? How do you take them to market? So they need some complementary investments. They were going to give us a project, but they never gave it to us. We couldn't work how we wanted because some people had arrived, and if they didn't come, they couldn't give it. Some people hadn't arrived, and if they didn't come, and Cora said, they couldn't give us a project. So it's like a technical disqualification. It's like in Peru. We're going to give you a project, but oh no, everybody hasn't arrived, so we can't give you a project. Like it's a technical disqualification. Okay, 1998, they're displaced by paramilitaries after they've been given this land. Okay, what does Incora do? Oh, the campesinos are not there anymore. They declare the land is vacant and settle a different 35 families in the same pieces of land in El Carpintero. Those people left also. Paramilitaries are still there, okay? Anyway, there was nothing to do. This is one of the campesinos talking, who's been displaced in Villavicencio. There's nothing to do, not a single project. There was land, but there was nothing to do, okay? So the paramilitaries are there, but there's no economic prospects either. Then, the famous victims law comes in, President Santos's land restitution law. Now what happens? Well, you have two sets of people, who've both been given titles to the same pieces of land, who've all been displaced by the paramilitaries. Now what happens? They fight. They fight over, who's in possession of the land. Why did you leave voluntarily? Some of these families have been left with no option but to become opponents in the case. So now they all fight over the land because Incora just, kind of super dysfunctional. Okay. So those three examples. How would I think about those? Okay. Well, you could advance a sort of conventional interpretation. Okay. For example, Peruvian politics is corrupt and, Odebrecht, and the poor voters, what can they do? They can only fight back the way they can, but this bicentennial candidate is really interesting. That guy didn't bribe anybody in order to win that competition. He was actually embarrassed that he won and all these 119 people had been disqualified. So there's something else going on there, okay? Argentina, same thing. All this queuing, patience of the state, you're eligible for this policy, but you can't receive it. An economist would say, oh, you're just creating red tape, and the bureaucrats are creating red tape to get people to bribe them. But there's no evidence of bribery in that study. In fact, no one's bribing. You're just waiting. You'll come back, you wait, you come back, the place is closed. They tell you to come on Monday. Monday's a holiday. You show up, it's closed. It shuts at odd hours, it opens, it's not, no one's asking for bribes. That's not what's driving it, okay? So it's not about corruption. There's remarkably little of that in Aullero's ethnography of waiting, okay? And same thing in Incora, you might think, oh yeah, it's Incora's being bribed by people and, of course that creates all these pressures and contradictory outcomes. That may not be completely wrong, but I think probably the bigger story that I've always heard about who's bribing Incora is, elites bribing Incora not to issue titles, So it's not the campesinos that are bribing Incora, that doesn't seem to be going on here either. Okay, so what we'd like to do is sort of, I think for us, these examples are difficult to explain, and many, you could pile up examples like this. There's just three, but they're very difficult to explain from this sort of conventional political economy, power-focused approach. Okay, so we're going to propose a different way to think about these examples, and Jose is going to talk about that.
Thank you. So wonderful.
This requires an enormous amount of coordination here. Yeah, staggering amount of coordination.
Exactly. So here we go. You see my screen now?
Yes.
Wonderful. So where do we think this is coming from? I mean, again, you have all these dysfunctionalities, you have all these strange things that are going on that are not possibly to be, that they are not described, or they are not really effectively described by mere notion of corruption, and there are some elites that are basically controlling everything. That is, in neither of those, I mean, those are not, there are not really explanations. No, they don't really come with any explanations. As James says, where, I mean, this guy didn't bribe anyone. And again, the thing about the Aullero case is very clear, that it is, I mean, the loudest thing that you can have there is the fact that, there is never a mention of corruption, which I think is very, very interesting. So where is this coming from? Where would you think this will be coming from? Well, there might be a possibility to look at it as historically, and I want to go back a few centuries, but they all have, because all these cases have, something in common. One is a belief and a disposition that there is a double order between an official realm, which is always, official. We will leave some papers on the paperwork that we leave and traces, and the real, which is, the real life, quote unquote. And in the case of Encora is super fascinating to see that, you know. And what we can see then is that this has been possibly, you know, something that was possibly laid out in the way the law and the way that order, Hispanic order, was basically implemented in the New World, in the Spanish Empire. You know, think about the way that where cities were created. As you well know, you know, it was astonishing the velocity by which cities were created in Latin America. You know, in basically the whole Spanish Empire. You know, by 1570, you know, most of the cities that we know were already established and founded. You know, and they were all founded in one particular way, which was what? You know, in this perfect grid, you know, perfect grid organization in which time, you know that the amount of time that makes you walk one street is exactly the same thing as in every other street. You know, time and space coincide. You know, so this is a perfectly rational city, a perfectly legible city in terms of, and the way in which the order was created, the word of the law. As you know, the very center was where the law was, la bácula, the mandate, and the law was there, and it irradiated around it, and in the main plaza. So spatially, you have that. And obviously, you know, as you can see, you know, the Spanish Empire was basically a correlation of a network of cities. You know, you go from one city to the other one, because outside the city, there was nothing. There was a very stark division between the outside of the city and the city itself, because there was legal order, and outside there was no order. It's just wilderness. Okay, this is, for example, the way in which was depicted Santo Domingo. You know, so what we believe is that, you know, there is this notion of, and this was being first, you know, opened by Tiza, or by Angel Rama, a very famous Uruguayan intellectual, Uruguayan intellectual, who wrote this quite famous book called La Ciudad Letrada, the lettered city, you know, in which what you have is a first, you know, impulse to understand, you know, that what mattered a lot in the creation of these ideal cities, you know, is something that is at the basis of also the way in which everything has been ordered in Latin America, in terms of not really understanding reality, quote unquote, but understanding the potentiality and the utopic capacity. These are basically utopic cities. These are cities that are that the grid is absolutely utopic. You know, you cannot maintain a grid for a long time, you know, because they are what? They are a lot of, like, you know, geographical problems, you know, I mean, in every single city, you know. So the grid starts dissolving after a while. But again, once more, what you had is basically this notion of ordered city. And the idea was that will become the dream, and that dream will become a reality, you know? And the idea was that the city itself was an ideal layout, in the same way that our legal order was, that our educational order was, which basically, what it does is basically puts potential over reality. You know, ultimately, that's what happens. What you have is basically this disconnect between the ideal, or the way in which for the plane of orders, laws, you know, that's a realm that is ideal, you know, and then you have reality, and those two never connect. Instead of one deriving from the other, or one connecting with the other, what you have basically is a very strong sense of a potential of utopia over the notion of reality. And those two never coincide, obviously. And what you are seeing is basically, after many, many centuries, these disconnections, these problems, that these disconnections between those two realms. Reality wanted to really come up, and obviously the ideal, the way in which the realm of the public of the letter, the legal code, the ideal is basically trying to tram it on trying to understand what is going on reality itself. So that's a way of basically, something that could be very clearly understood, I think, and one of the possibilities in which this might happen. You see this everywhere. You see this from the Bronx, for example, in the creation of El Cartucho, of the eradication of El Cartucho, and then the eradication of the Bronx. Then what happens is that this gets completely displaced all the time, But for centuries, what has happened is this very strange notion of the ideal realm in which civilization should be and we should live like, has basically created for centuries has created, this rift, the gulf between reality and the way in which we used to code our norms, has become larger and larger and larger, And that has basically created something that I think we all Latin Americans share to some degree, that the sensation of our civilization is not necessarily rooted in our territories. That there is this notion of civilization is actually what? Foreign. It's actually outside. It comes from the outside. It comes from Europe. The Europeans do have a tradition, quote unquote, of being civil. I mean, you can see how their civilization is a reflect of their traditions and their way of living, and we do not. I don't want to argue if it is correct or not. I'm just simply saying that there is a sensation there, that there is that the notion of civilization is not rooted, doesn't come from us. I just want to show you the frontispiece of the Repertorio Americano. After 3 centuries of having Spanish in the region, what as you know, Repertorio Americano was the magazine and the journal that that Andrés Bello and everyone who was fighting for independence for Latin America had in London. And what you have here is basically, once more, civilization. You can see civilization coming to visit the Americas, coming to stay with the Americas. I mean, because it is no longer part of it. It has never been, quote unquote, part after even 3 centuries of Spanish ruling. There is the kid has a compass here because it represents science, music here, and here you come, civilization, liberty, all the ideals of Europe are coming to our primitive, people, quote unquote, and in our very, very complicated and difficult geography that we have in front. Civilization was still a visitor and not a native of the Americas. So this has created, in general, this sensation, this pervasive sensation of unrootedness, has been one that has been behind, I think, many of our beliefs of what our countries are, and has basically, to a large degree, and that's what more or less we're suggesting with James, is that has basically contributed to not only this difference between center and periphery, but also contributed to basically producing or continue to produce models and to exchange models that are foreign, quote unquote, continuously being not part of of really coming out of looking at reality itself in Latin America. So there is a deep-seated perception that our culture, all our culture, is not rooted, that is postiza. And postizo basically means to be out of place or to be added, to be an add-on. And this comes from centuries of writers and people, looking at the way in which, these two things collide. That this ideal plane of civilization, very stark, very ideal, very clear, that is graphic in the city, is no longer capable or is completely broken from reality itself. On one side, you have the realm of the formal. On the other side, you have reality moving around in different ways. Humboldt, being a clear example of that, shows us, that, one of the things that he saw in all his troubles was the fact that, that in America, traditions and civilization does not hold to the land itself, And here you have a quote about it, que influye también en los lazos más o menos fuertes que sujetan al colono al suelo que habita, a la forma de las rocas que circunda su cabaña, a los árboles que han sombreado su cuna. What he could see is this very stark difference as coming from a German romanticism that was very obvious. But not only that, you had one of the most famous, extremely and most famous, sociologists, the one who basically coded, quote unquote, the idea that we have about what Cuban culture is, which is a mixture of the system of production of tobacco and the system of production of sugar, and how those two things combine. And those are always in a contrapunteo, the very famous word contrapunteo cubano, el tabaco y azúcar, was also one that actually showed this, in Cuba. There is a desajuste, as he said, because, as he said, hombres, economías, culturas y anhelos, todo aquí se sintió foráneo, provisional, cambiadizo, aves de paso sobre el país, a su costa, a su contra, y a su malgrado. So, once more, what you have basically, this stark division that since the very beginning is posed between the ideal and the local does not allow to have one to be transmitted into the other one. And basically what you keep having is basically just this sensation that anything that is civilizatory is always aves de paso, is always transitional, is always provisional, is always foreign. And that's why it could be changed continuously. Roberto Schwartz talking about Brazil, you have exactly the same thing, we Brazilians and other Latin Americans constantly experience the artificial, inauthentic, and imitative nature of our cultural life. You have that very clear. But for us, a very famous example is this case of Doña Fela. And Doña Fela was the first mayor of the city of San Juan, Puerto Rico. And Doña Fela, graphically, for me, one of the greatest ideas about how provincial or how colonial, if you want to put it is the new terminology, or it is the terminology we're using these days, is in some ways, our national imagination. Doña Fela wanted to every Puerto Rican kid to experience White Christmas. We're in the middle of the tropics, one of the hottest places, in the region, And again, Doña Fela rented from 1946 to 1952, I think 3 or 4 times, rented planes from what it was called Easter Airlines at the time, in order to fly 2 tons of snow, that were thrown from the planes for kids to experience White Christmas, And that's what you can see there. Doña Fela is with a snowman, which is melting extremely rapidly, in the scorching sun of San Juan, So again, Again, I can continue with like José Guillermo Núñez, El laberinto de la Soledad. Once more, there is a form of realm that does not reach quotidian social practices. These are all, I'm just giving you a large number of cases of extremely famous sociologists and anthropologists that basically are showing, how this disconnection is felt continuously. Una vez más, in the case of El laberinto de la Soledad by Núñez, esa tensión entre palabras que no alcanzan a moldear una realidad social y un mundo de prácticas cotidianas que no alcanza a ser pronunciado, en nuestra más típica configuración cultural de las últimas décadas. They're talking about Peru, of course. So this is what this is one of the things that, I mean, just to end up with Cabrujas, the most famous theater player of Venezuela, and talking about the way in which, he conceived this notion of the state of the way in which the state was created in Venezuela, which was the state was a magnanimous sorcerer. Once more, and that is a very famous quote of Cabrujas: "El Estado es un estado mágico" in Venezuela. They all point out to one major thing, which is basically there is a very strong ideal here, that there is more that what matters in terms of form, in terms of laws, in terms of what we will call the lettered city, is potentiality, is an utopic version, is something that at some point will overcome, reality itself, which was nimities, and obviously that has more for 5 centuries has basically produced this idea, that this particular parcel of reality, which is the letter city, is foreign in its nature. That is, that any sort of civilizatory is actually not from us, quote unquote, because it has been basically not capable of really addressing real issues or things that actually come of our own reality, but are actually coming out just as there will be paracaidistas or from a UFO from Europe, quote unquote. So that's something that I wanted to. There is this disconnection, a historic disconnection, in which there is a perpetual. I mean, and think about this in the technical aspects of the technical disqualification. They're not paying attention to reality. I mean, they're not paying attention to what happened to the other 119 cases. They might have been apt, quote unquote, if they would look what reality is, but they were not. They were just simply looking at an ideal. And that makes them produce results such as there is only one winner, which is not a real winner. And this happens exactly the same in the case as in the case of Incora. These are basically, just the machine reproduces itself. It's just, well, just produce new titles. Let's do this again. They're looking at the letter of the law and not the spirit of it, because looking at the spirit, it will imply to actually move closer to reality. So that is where I leave it, and I want to give it to James in order to see where can he move to somewhere else, and show possibilities of this moving out of this disequilibrium or fundamental disequilibrium.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, here we go. Oh. All right, sorry. So I don't know if that's too much for columnists to get your minds around, but I think any of you listening who've been in a seminar with somebody from Planación in Bogota, where somebody appears with a 50-page PowerPoint, with bullet point after bullet point of all the policies they're going to implement and all the they're going to do, gets this, that there's a fundamental disequilibrium between the image of the Colombian, the self-image of the Colombian state and kind of reality. There's a disconnect between, there's a disequilibrium, we'd like to say, And I think, we think that this examples than some. We're not saying that this political economy stuff doesn't go on. It does, but this goes on too. This disequilibrium goes on too, and maybe many of the things you think about are derivative of that. For example, clientelism. Like why is there so much clientelism in Latin America? Well, what is clientelism about? Aguillero's definition of Aguillero has a fantastic book about clientelism called Poor People's Politics. His definition is, clientelism is problem solving. It's politically mediated problem solving. Where do the problems come from? Well, you have this massive disequilibrium. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's going to be problems. The state is promising things it can't possibly deliver. There's this nuestras familias, it doesn't have, it's not going to deliver it. You don't get it, so who can you go to? You go to clientelism is mediating that problem. Why are Colombians so unhappy? Why are they protesting? And, because they're being promised all these things, which the state can't possibly deliver, but somehow the state thinks it can deliver. President Santos thinks he can write this peace agreement with the FARC, and then all these things are going to happen, and they don't happen. And somehow it's predictable, but it's not understood. I mean, I don't understand that. I've been in many contexts in Colombia where this is going on, and I'm always just told I'm spoiling the party. I was at a conference a few years ago when José Antonio Ocampo was heading the Misión Rural. And we had a seminar at the Jorge Tadeo Lozano in Bogota. And Jose Antonio stood up, with his 50-page PowerPoint, and on slide 14, bullet point 8, it said, we will give a written land title, to every rural Colombian, And I put my hand up and I said, come on, like, seriously, how is that ever going to happen? It hasn't happened in 500 years. Tell me how that's going to happen. And one of the Farquista intellectuals, Dario Fajardo, who's a sociologist at the Universidad Nacional, who's advising the FARC, he said to me, "Oh, you're just a neoliberal guy, aren't you? Like you don't want the government to do things." And I said, "I do want the government to do things, but I know it will never do that. It will never do that." But everyone pretended it would. The FARC pretended it would. The Misión Rural pretended. There's a fundamental cognitive disequilibrium here, we're just like, and I think our view here is that that's actually very deeply rooted in the construction of societies in the new world, this utopian ideal, the grid, the disconnect, the dichotomy between the city and the country, between the civilized and barbarism, Miguel Antonio Caro, who wrote the Regeneration Constitution in Colombia, he never left the Sabana de Bogota in his entire life. He didn't want to go down off the mountain, because out there it was a jungle, and so I think the idea is that our idea is that this helps understand these examples, much better. What's going on in Peru is just this kind of disequilibrium between the rules and the reality. And the rules are very specific and rigid, and the reality is not like that, and it doesn't. But when you try to apply it, 119 people get disqualified. Okay, same with Argentina. It's not corruption. It's just the state is supposed to do all these things, but it's not organized to do that, and it's out of equilibrium with society. And the same with Incora. It's not that there isn't corruption in Cora or whatever, but there's also other things going on too. It's not that President Santos, had some nefarious Machiavellian idea. He just has a model of how things work in Colombia, which is out of equilibrium with the reality, and that's somehow deeply cultural and historical. So and we think this has all sorts of implications here. So it's just talking about some of the implications here. This idea of obedezco pero no cumplo. Okay, that's an obvious principle you'd want to have. If you're in a situation of disequilibrium then of course, you have to adjust. You have to adjust to that disequilibrium. That's where I obey, you know, but I do not comply. I'm not going to comply because that's going to create chaos. But, you know, I sort of recognize it's all part of this equilibrium. Okay, the demand for clientelism. You know, I talked about that, you know, and this idea of this aves de paso, you know, this is an idea that we're still, you know, like this idea that this creates this sort of, this disequilibrium creates this unease, you know, this unease. And what's the consequence of that? Well, you know, maybe this endless sort of starting over again, you know, like the journal, the page of the journal that José showed you from the 1820s of like we're starting over again with it's 300 years later, but we're still coming to civilize, you know, the people will end up, you know, and this is, you know, and isn't that in Colombia? It's like reforms. It's the reform. We think we can solve everything by rewriting the constitution. We think we can reform. we solve the problems by reform. We have more reform. What do we need now? We need more reforms, you know. So that, you know, like, there's many implications of that, I think. So, but I think, yeah. So you know, here's I said what Aguillero's definition of political economy was. So let me. But I think we're going to run out of time. So, and we have run out of time. So I'm just going to finish by saying. So that's a set of ideas we're working on about, and I think every Colombian knows what we're talking about, because I've just experienced that in so many contexts in Colombia, this sort of disequilibrium. And so we're trying to sort of embed that in these intellectual traditions and sort of try to understand it in a deeper way. Okay, so you know, we raise this question of like, are there grounds for optimism? You know, and in some sense we're sort of struggling with that. But you know, here's 3 reasons to be optimistic. You know, if you know, the extractive state is much less hegemonic than you'd think if you read Why Nations Fail. Okay, there's much more. There's space. There's room for alternative projects to emerge, and they have. You know, and that's an optimistic thing. The state is out of equilibrium with society in Latin America. You could say, you know, we're arguing that's very deeply rooted culturally, yeah. So that's not easy to change, but maybe it can change. Maybe there can be sociological change of the sort that's happening in Peru. That's going to create a very different sort of society with a very different image of itself and its possibilities, and that's also something which is much more amenable to change than some very power-based, you know, extractive system. But it means that you have to look in different places. You know, you're not looking at the anti-corruption audits and your agenda of fiscal tax reforms. This is much more about social change and cultural change. Think about Antanas Mockus. You know, what was his idea? That was exactly that. It was about, we need to, you know, it's a kind of changing, it's a cultural change that society needs. And so that's about thinking in a different way about possibilities and differences. And the third thing, I don't have time to talk about it. I put my slides here. So if you want to go through it, you can read it. But the third thing we wanted to say is, you know, I'm sort of criticizing this, you know, we're criticizing this Weberian idea of like, you know, where we should be going. We should be going to this, you know, and we never get there for some reason. But we're always reforming and we're trying to get there, and it's frustrating. But I guess we're sort of saying, maybe you're heading at the wrong thing. You're heading for the wrong target, you know, and you're not using the strengths in your society that are already there, because you have this wrong goal in mind. Okay, so states are sort of culturally embedded in society, and you know, the example of Rwanda, you know, is useful for the following reason. You know, because the Rwandan state, on the face of it, looks like, you know, a very weak state. It's very bad at raising taxes and other things. But it's actually had an incredible amount of capacity. And why is that? Because it's linked through all these social networks to society. Okay, in African studies, they call this a segmentary state. It's a kind of fusion of modern state institutions with very dense kinship networks and social networks. And the thing about the Rwandan state is that, so typically in social science, you'd sort of say, oh, that sounds patrimonial. You know, if you've read Weber, it's and redistribution. But actually what the Rwandan state does is it leverages those networks to get things done, to provide public goods, to mobilize people, to build roads or schools or whatever. So it uses those networks to achieve things, okay? So if you can do that in Rwanda, why can't you do it in Colombia, you know? Why can't you leverage networks in order to do that, okay? So that's why I wanted to talk about that. It's a very new thing that I've been working on for the last few months, and we're still collecting data, and we have regressions, and you can read the thing. But I just want to throw out there, and I could give other examples of this, that social networks, you know, are not just about clientelism and redistribution and patronage. That's the sort of hegemonic way that we tend to think about them in social science. But there are very salient examples which show that you can do other things with that. You can do stuff with that. And so how should I build the Colombian state, or how should I move Colombia forward? Should I do it by, you know, putting Musa Besai in prison, you know, or arresting all the crooks in Cordoba or Sucre? Well, we do that there again and again and again and again and again, and nothing changes. You know, the structural situation doesn't change. So why is that? You know, that's like starting over again. You know, we keep doing the same thing, but it doesn't work. So instead, maybe we need to think about this in a different way and think about, how do we leverage that? How do we get that, use those networks and sort of turn the logic on its head? And instead of just thinking about it the way we do, think about it as something that could be used productively, not something which is in the way of building some modern state, which is a sort of fantasy, but actually as a basis on which one could construct a much more sort of sociologically or culturally rooted but effective state, which is what's true in Rwanda. So that was, we wanted to finish with these three different ways. Like I said, it's about lateral thinking. You know, this is about lateral thinking today. You know, I've contributed to this hegemonic vision of Latin American development. Now we're saying, you know, let's think laterally about this. Let's think about different scenarios and different mechanisms and different possible futures and different strategies for building something different too. And so that was, I hope that's the spirit that we managed to communicate today. And thank you for your patience. Yeah. And thank you, Jose, for giving.
Thank you. I mean, if you guys have questions, you know, we're here, you know, whatever, you know, it's excellent. It's always wonderful to understand. And the Rwanda thing looks fascinating.
Yeah, I didn't have time to talk about that, but that's okay. Yeah, I think, you know, everyone, we've been here for 3 hours, but you know, everyone has my email. I'm around, you know, I'm happy to talk to people if they want to talk about some of the ideas. And more to the point, we have a take-home exam this weekend on which you will not be examined about La Ciudad Letrada. But yeah, so good luck on your take-home exam, and yeah, so reach out. I hope you had fun. Yes,
thank you.
Today was not about algebra. It was about ideas. But ideas are good, you know.
Other kind of algebra.
Okay.
Yeah. Have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias, James. Gracias, José.
Gracias.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Yes. Hope you had
Muchas
fun.
gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias.